Imagine that it's the year 2030. NATO forces operating somewhere near the Baltic coastline have come across a truly frightening sight. The Russian forces on the opposite end of no man's land are outfitted in body armor, which makes them look like a unit of robo-cops. Their faces are covered with an intimidating helmet and visor that gives them an edge in the information domain. Their chests and all of their extremities are protected by overlapping bullet-resistant plates. To make matters worse, their armor also has an integrated exoskeleton that increases their strength, speed, and endurance. The protective power of their armor is also unparalleled. Even 50 caliber Browning machine gun rounds don't have enough stopping power to put these guys down. What's a NATO unit to do in the face of such fearsome enemies? Well, not much, because this scenario is likely to be as imaginary as anything that Hollywood can produce. Meet the Sotnik, Russia's next-generation body armor that worried defense officials and military experts when it was unveiled. If it works as advertised, there is reason indeed to be worried, but it probably won't. And there is a long history of Russian body armor failures to believe that it won't. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, defense and foreign policy analysts regarded its military as the second most capable fighting force in the world. It had demonstrated its post-Soviet prowess with experience in Chechnya in the 1990s and 2000s, Georgia in 2008, and Ukraine in 2014, when it rapidly secured control of Crimea. It was also a fearsome military. Experts remembered the devastation the Russian Air Force and artillery units had brought to the Chechen city of Grozny during multiple battles in the 1990s. Aside from the Kremlin building a formidable artillery-based land force that would be resilient against air attacks, experts also touted Russia's new, technologically advanced weapon systems. These platforms included the new 5th-generation Su-57 fighter jet and the T-14 Armata main battle tank, which was supposedly more advanced than any other tank in foreign arsenals. However, when Russia launched the invasion, these theories quickly got tossed to the winds. The supposedly fearsome Russian war machine proved hard-pressed to supply itself over even short distances. The T-14 and Su-57 were almost nowhere to be seen, and Russian soldiers found themselves bogged down in a costly war of attrition, suffering from poor command doctrine and Western weapons like the Javelin and HIMARS, which proved so devastating to their supposedly latest and greatest gear. Even the venerable Patriot air defense system, which first came online in the 1980s, was able to knock one of Russia's ultra-modern Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, which Vladimir Putin had once touted as invincible, out of the sky. Now the Russian military is boasting about its next-generation body armor, the Sotnik. If it delivers as promised, it will protect its wearer better than any other body armor system in the world. But like most Russian boasting, there's a lot of hype about the Sotnik and not a whole lot of facts. Since 2016, Russian troops have worn the Ratnik II body armor system, accompanied by the 6B45 helmet. The Ratnik's vest has an effective area protection that is larger than most other body-comparable armor systems. Based on a material similar to Kevlar, the Ratnik covers 90% of a soldier's body, and its granite ceramic plates can withstand 10 sniper rifle shots from a distance of only 10 meters. It is a good system to protect against shrapnel and explosive fragments too. The Ratnik's overalls protect the entire body from these flying pieces of metal and other debris. Ratnik II takes care to protect the groin and extremities like the hands. The 6B45 helmet, meanwhile, covers an area of 30 square decimeters with effective protection. Despite this, the helmet remains light at only 1 kilogram, which means that Russian military personnel can attach various instruments to it without adding undue strain on their necks. Such equipment includes thermal and night vision binoculars, flashlights, and a communication system with specialized headphones. Perhaps most impressively, the Ratnik II body armor has an electromagnetic camouflage system that shields its wearer from infrared sensors. The armor weighs between 40 and 50 pounds, but some of the weight is relieved by a passive carbon fiber exoskeleton. The exoskeleton also protects its wearer's spine and joints from the gradual wear and tear that lugging around such heavy weight will do to a person over time. This exoskeleton does not need an external power source to function. Ratnik is supposed to be getting an upgrade too. In 2020, Russia announced it would be developing its Ratnik III body armor system. This version would include an integrated exoskeleton, a helmet visor-mounted target designation system, stealth fabric, anti-mine boots, a vision system via electric goggles that would allow soldiers to link up with the camera views of small drones and see tactical orders or maps of the broader area, and an anti-thermal and anti-radar camouflage suit. The integrated exoskeleton for the Ratnik 3 was getting an upgrade as well. It was reportedly designed to comfortably haul weights of up to 132 pounds during combat operations. In 2021, American military planners were nervous about these developments. There was the feeling that the United States was lagging behind on body armor and exoskeleton systems for its soldiers and Marines. The revelation of Sotnik made American defense officials and think tanks even more nervous. Now they know better. Unfortunately for Russia, much of the hype about the Ratnik was a bunch of boasts, as we've come to expect by now. In 2017, the Russian army said it had received 200,000 sets of Ratnik 2 body armor. The following year, the Russian Ministry of Defense said it expected that all of its military personnel would be equipped with the Ratnik 2 by 2020. But 2020 came and went, and the Russian military failed in its goal. The invasion of Ukraine proved as such. Instead of getting standard-issue gear, Russian troops fighting in Ukraine, even those in the regular army at the start of the invasion, have had to make do with what body armor they could get. Most of the Ratnik's claims failed to materialize on the battlefield. Complaints about body armor and helmet malfunction have been frequent in the Russian ranks throughout the course of the war. Instead of the new Ratnik, some of the luckier Russian troops have been seen wearing older 6B23 body armor in Ukraine. This armor can be protective against indirect impacts like shrapnel or shell fragments, but lacks the ability to adequately defend its wearer from direct ballistic hits. Even if the enemy gunshots fail to penetrate the 6B23, the armor cannot easily disperse the energy the impacting bullets transfer to the human body. Broken bones and internal trauma were frequently reported among those who wore 6B23 body armor and suffered combat-related injuries. These shortcomings are what prompted the Kremlin to replace the 6B23 with the Ratnik family of armors in the first place. However, complete Ratnik armors were few and far between on the battlefields of Ukraine. What happened? Typical corruption within the Russian military's ranks has proven part of its body armor failures. In 2021, a Russian captain and ensign were convicted of stealing 56 sets of body armor and selling them online. The captain got a sentence of 6 years and the ensign got 7 years. Both of them are currently serving time in a penal colony. These two may have been made an example of, but they were hardly the only ones. It's common for officers in the Russian military to sell off top-of-the-line gear to line their own pockets, and then issue Cold War-era equipment to the soldiers under their command instead. The Russian military's body armor problems got much worse when Vladimir Putin announced partial mobilization in the fall of 2022, as Ukraine was pushing his forces back in Kharkiv and Kherson, and he desperately needed additional manpower. According to defense intelligence officials in the UK, the conscripts Russia mobilized in late 2022 often had no choice but to buy their own body armor because Russian armories were short. Many of the armor kits that these people and their families wound up buying turned out to be fake too. Those lucky enough to get their hands on real Ratnik armor often wound up becoming victims of theft, as poorly equipped Russian regular troops at the front simply stole it from them. The demand led to a boom in the price of any kind of body armor that even looked real on Russian e-commerce sites. Body armor, and we use that term loosely in this context, can now fetch up to $650 a piece online in Russia. This is a price that most of the soldiers in Ukraine and their families cannot afford, especially because a disproportionate amount of the people conscripted to fight in the autumn of 2022 came from Russia's poorer ethnic minority communities. Ukrainian soldiers who have captured body armor worn by Russian soldiers on the battlefield have often found such gear fitted with cheap steel plates instead of the high-tech ceramics, which are now designed to slow the bullet down to reduce its impacting force. The ceramic plates in high-quality body armor like the American Interceptor also fracture and deform the bullet itself as it impacts the vest. This fracturing and deforming in turn distributes the bullet's energy over a wider area to protect the wearer against blunt force trauma. While some armies use steel instead of ceramics in their body armor, this steel is extremely tensile and specially manufactured to stand up to small arms ballistics. The captured steel plates in Ukraine, though, have proven little match for small arms fire. Standard 9mm parabellum rounds were shown to puncture the steel plates on videos posted to social media by Ukrainian soldiers. Rifle rounds easily did the job. They are little more than steel sheets stolen from somewhere else and fitted into what was supposed to be body armor. Captured Russian body armor also seemed to be little more than a cloth covering to hold the faulty steel plates in place. This is in contrast to Western body armor, which is made from Kevlar and other fabrics engineered to be resistant to small arms fire and shrapnel or explosive fragments. The Russian armor, meanwhile, seemed like it would only be good against fragments or shrapnel in the area that the plates directly covered. Indeed, Ukrainian troops have been seen on video bending the steel plates in captured Russian body armor with their hands, feet, and over their knees. They laugh contemptuously as they do so. This equipment is probably not official Ratnik armor, but rather knockoffs sold on Russian e-commerce sites. However, one Russian conscript even complained on video that he was given a vest that would only be effective against an airsoft gun. It turns out that the Russian logistics brass opted to buy the toy replicas of Ratnik armor for their mobilized soldiers and pocketed the rest of the money allocated to them. Even if Russian soldiers or conscripts are lucky enough to get their hands on legitimate Ratnik armor, it is often not a complete kit. Corruption is so widespread in the Russian military that the ceramic plates inside the Ratnik vests are often missing, either to cut costs or because they are valuable commodities to sell off in their own right. Corrupt Russian logistics officers instead sold off the ceramics and replaced them with the cheap, non-ballistic steel plates that Ukrainian soldiers made fun of in the videos. The lack of effective body armor in Ukraine has proven devastating for the Russian war effort. At the end of August 2023, the Pentagon released estimates which painted a grim picture for the Russians. According to the US military, total Russian casualties over the 18-month war were approaching the 300,000 mark. This total included about 120,000 dead and 170 to 180,000 combat-related injuries. Ukraine, meanwhile, was suffering too, with 70,000 KIA and between 100 and 120,000 wounded. However, the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians by nearly 3 to 1 on the battlefields of Ukraine. There are many reasons for this disparity in casualties despite Russia's manpower advantage, but the lack of proper body armor is a big one. The Russian body armor industry is in such a poor state that the military is now turning to Chinese equipment to make up for its shortcomings. China has been reluctant to provide military aid to Russia for fear of Western sanctions, but some Chinese firms have been supplying their beleaguered strategic partner with weapons and equipment through backdoor means. Such aid includes body armor. 12 tons worth of Chinese body armor were routed to Russia through Turkey in late 2022. The body armor came from companies such as Xinjiang Guangzhou Import and Export Company. Chinese companies have also sent component parts to Russian body armor manufacturers like Class, although it's not currently understood how widespread the Class vests have been used in Ukraine. Ukrainian soldiers have captured Class vests on the battlefield too, although it's also unclear if these contain Chinese component parts. Ukrainian troops have been known to sell these captured materials online. Chinese body armor has been tested by American defense officials. This type of body armor uses aramid fibers, which are the same kind of fibers found in the familiar Kevlar vests used in the United States and other Western militaries. In the tests, the Chinese body armor's ceramic plates succeeded in stopping standard small arms fire, such as the 7.62mm round, from penetrating. However, the plates showed significant deformation. The deformation indicates that soldiers wearing this armor would suffer from blunt force trauma if struck by enemy fire, because the energy would not be dispersed over a wide enough area. If Russian troops are looking to this equipment to save them, they will probably wind up being disappointed. So as with many other aspects of its military, Russian body armor looks great on parade grounds and in the Kremlin's information networks. On the battlefield, not so much, and the results in Ukraine show it. For Russia, anything that can go wrong does seem to go wrong, thanks to institutional incompetence on every conceivable level. Now Russia has plans for its next-generation body armor, the Sotnik system, which the Kremlin says will come online in 2025, replacing the Ratnik family of armors. The armor was unveiled in early 2021, about a year before the invasion of Ukraine. The armor developed by Russia's state Rostec Corporation would be the most advanced and protective body armor in the world, if it works as advertised. But what have we come to learn about Russia's military's claims by now? According to Rostec, the Sotnik armor would be capable of protecting its wearer against small arms fire and even a direct hit from the 50 caliber Browning machine gun round, which can pierce lightly armored vehicles at a range of 2 kilometers. To protect against the shock of incoming rounds like the .50 BMG, which can transfer more than enough energy to kill, even if the bullet does not penetrate the body, the Sotnik armor will be made from ultra-high molecular weight polythene fibers. These fibers will be designed to not restrict a soldier's movement, even with the added protection. This principle works in theory because polythene is a plastic and plastic is light. But this raises a question: how can a plastic protect you against gunfire, let alone a .50 caliber round? As you would expect, plastics melt at high enough temperatures, including the heat a bullet makes as it transfers its energy to a target. The melting fibers adhere to the bullet and slow it down, allowing the other parts of the armor to stop it from penetrating and transfer its energy over a broader area. Because of its heavy use of plastics, the total weight of a set of Sotnik armor will supposedly be reduced by 20 pounds from the Ratnik family of armors. All in all, a set of Sotnik body armor will weigh around 44 pounds, according to Rostec. And as if all the cutting-edge technology wasn't enough, Rostec says it will develop an active titanium exoskeleton to integrate with the armor in the future. Rostec is researching power sources for how this feature would work. As early as 2021, however, there were some military and engineering experts who were skeptical about Russian claims. Since ancient times, armor has always been a compromise between protection and mobility. Too much protection leaves a wearer immobile. It's why some units from then to now chose not to wear any body armor at all. For them, mobility was their best protection. Other units preferred to fight with heavier armor because they did not expect to need a lot of mobility. The latest question in this age-old compromise is, can polythene armor capable of stopping a .50 caliber machine gun round be made lightweight enough for a soldier to actually be able to wear it and not be immobile? According to a 2021 analysis in Popular Mechanics, the answer was not promising. For comparison, a standard 7.62mm bullet transfers 1,878 pounds of force on its target. A .50 caliber Browning machine gun round is over 4 times that, at 11,070. To put that into perspective, this weight would be the same as if a 5-ton truck was sitting on your chest. American military gear can stop standard rifle rounds like 7.62mm, with a total weight on the soldier at 22.6 pounds. This is a good compromise between protection and mobility. Stopping a .50 caliber round is a whole different story, however. That would take 1.25 inches of AR-500 grade steel plate, but this type of steel is far too heavy to comfortably wear. It would make a modern soldier the equivalent of a caricatured version of a medieval knight wearing armor that was too heavy to move around in. The amount of polythene plastic that would be needed to stop a .50 caliber round, even accounting for greater efficiency, would almost certainly be impossible to wear on the battlefield and remain mobile. Popular Mechanics mentioned that Russia could try to compensate for this reality by adding titanium plating to the ensemble of a far more realistic amount of polythene. Since titanium is lighter and stronger than steel, the idea seems feasible. There is also precedent for it. Armorers in the Soviet Union made body armor with titanium components during the Cold War. However, even with this modification, stopping a .50 caliber round and leaving a soldier mobile enough to move around would be very difficult. The verdict about the idea of body armor reliably stopping .50 caliber rounds? Feasible, but don't put your money on it. It's also worth mentioning that .50 caliber machine gun rounds can easily punch holes in cinder block walls. Even if the body armor does stop penetration, dispersing over 11,000 pounds of force safely around the human body would be difficult. The blunt force trauma from the impact of a .50 caliber round would still likely be enough to kill. So even if the logistics to outfit all of Russia's soldiers with Sotnik body armor by 2025 work out, and there is every reason, as we've seen by now, to believe that they won't, the Sotnik still has a long way to go to prove the Kremlin's claims. If we have not learned to doubt those by now, we have not learned anything from the 18-month war in Ukraine. But what do you think about Russia's next-generation Sotnik body armor? Does it even have a chance of living up to the claims the Kremlin makes of it? Let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. When you break down the T-90 on paper, Russia's most modern battle tank looks pretty fierce. Among other high-tech accessories, it boasts a 125mm smoothbore gun, modular composite armor, and a 1,000+ horsepower V12 diesel engine. In theory, it offers excellent mobility, protection, and firepower, along with the ability to launch armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot rounds and anti-tank guided missiles. The T-90 also has several variants and has been a popular export due to its relatively high cost-to-benefit ratio. Then why, you might be wondering, has the T-90 been such an epic failure on the battlefield? To be fair, it's not just the T-90s that are dropping like flies, as Russia's war with Ukraine continues. Since February last year, the Russian Armored Corps losses have since reached more than 2,100 tanks. That's around 2/3 of the tanks Russia initially rolled out of Moscow on their way to Kyiv. Russia has lost so many tanks, in fact, that they've had to reactivate and deploy hundreds of older models, including the T-72 Ural, T-62, and T-54-55, some of which are 50, 60, even 70 years old. And most of these have headed to the front without any meaningful upgrades, not since the collapse of the Soviet Union anyway, to their optics, fire control systems, or armor. It probably wasn't the first choice, one could imagine, of the boys back at the Kremlin to roll out these older models. This decision likely has something to do with the recent spike in losses of their prized T-90s. In total, Russian troops have been forced to scrap or abandon nearly 60 of these 53-ton, 3-person tanks, roughly 15% of Russia's pre-war inventory, with most being lost in only the last few months. But wait, aren't these supposed to be the baddest tanks around? That's certainly what the Kremlin's been saying. Before we get to the specific factors contributing to the T-90's proposed survivability, or lack thereof, let's take a moment to address one other important point. When we zoom out, there's an argument to be made that the increasing number of T-90s being destroyed on the battlefield in Ukraine might actually be a negative sign of things to come for our friends in Kyiv. How's that? Well, let's look at it like this. One reason that so many T-90s have been destroyed recently, but certainly not the only reason, is that there's been more of them deployed to destroy. Translation: Russia's current production of T-90s has been picking up, as Putin's nearly 2-year effort to boost tank production finally seems to be paying off. Apparently, Russia has been able to work around some of its increasingly tighter foreign sanctions, including those on critical high-end electronics that it was once importing from France. As mentioned before, the number of destroyed or captured T-90s accounts for roughly a quarter of Russia's pre-war inventory. This overall number, however, does not include the hundreds that have been produced by the Ural-Vagonzavod plant in Sverdlovsk Oblast since the start of 2022. Russia's increased productivity could become a serious problem for Ukraine, considering its main tank plant, the Malyshev factory in Kharkiv, currently lacks the capacity to produce new tanks from scratch and is limited to performing upgrades and repairs. This leaves Ukraine's armored forces mostly reliant on foreign donations if they intend to deploy a fleet of modern Western-style tanks, which they have, including German Leopard 2s, British Challenger 2s, and the American M1 Abrams. But are foreign donations going to be able to match Russian tank production? Well, it's hard to say, but it probably wouldn't hurt for Ukraine's Western allies to throw in a few more tanks, especially because the Ural-Vagonzavod plant can, hypothetically, produce enough new T-90s in the next 6 months to match Ukraine's current inventory of comparable modern battle tanks. But even if this theory is true, and an increasing number of T-90s are being destroyed largely because more are being manufactured and deployed, that certainly isn't the whole story. The overall effectiveness and functionality of the T-90 has been a matter of debate since the beginning, with many distinguished experts expertly concluding that overall, the T-90 is a piece of junk. First introduced as the T-72BU, then renamed the T-90 to distinguish it from all the other T-72 variants, the T-90 was thought to be one of the most well-protected tanks in the world, while also boasting one of the most heavily equipped battle systems currently on the market. After being officially brought into service in 1992, the T-90 has received a number of upgrades and subsequent name changes. In 2004, it was renamed the T-90A, and then in 2016, it was upgraded and rebranded again as the T-90M. Then, after its most recent upgrade in 2017, it came to be called the T-90MS. There were also less popular variants along the way, but those aren't worth mentioning here. Since its conception, one of the major selling points of the T-90 has been its relatively low cost. Save for the most recent variant, the T-90MS, which runs closer to $4 million, the full line of older, less expensive T-90 models can still be purchased and exported for around $3 million. Even though it continues to be produced primarily for use by the Russian Army's armored division, the Kremlin has sold and exported thousands of T-90s, mostly T-90S variants, to countries such as Algeria, Armenia, and Iraq. In fact, India alone is now in possession of more than 2,000 Russian-built T-90Ss. Underneath the hood, so to speak, of all currently available T-90 variants is a V12 diesel engine. The most powerful, coming in at 1,130 horsepower, can be found on the T-90MS. The T-90 is also about 20 tons lighter than the M1 Abrams, and was designed to accommodate and be operated by, thanks to its auto-loading firing system, just a 3-man crew. Upon closer inspection, however, the effectiveness of both the engine and loading system have come into question. But more on that a bit later. So what about firepower? Well, if the T-90 has one thing going for it, it definitely has a lot of that. The T-90's 2A46M4 125mm smoothbore main gun can fire a range of high-tech ammunition options, including armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds, as well as the anti-tank guided missiles mentioned earlier, also known as the 9M119 Reflex, or by NATO as the AT-11 Sniper. These high-tech projectiles have a maximum range of 4,000 meters, with a flight time of 11.7 seconds, and can, under certain conditions, even take down helicopters. Also in terms of firepower, the T-90 features 2 externally mounted machine guns. One is a 12.7mm cord-heavy machine gun that has a cycle rate of fire of 700 to 800 rounds per minute and can be remotely operated from within the tank. The other is a PKMT 7.62mm coaxial machine gun. And when it comes to protection, in addition to conventional armor plating, modern T-90 variants also come equipped with 2 very high-tech defensive systems. The first is the Shatora-1, an active protection system made by the Russian company Electronic Torg that includes a 360-degree laser warning receiver complete with automatically triggered countermeasures that deploy if the tank is painted by an enemy laser. This device can even orient the tank's main gun in the direction of the laser's origin. The Shatora-1, among other features, also comes with an infrared jammer and a grenade-launching system that has the capacity to discharge smoke grenades which release an infrared obscuring aerosol cloud. The modern T-90's second line of defense is its Contact 5 Explosive Reactive Armor, or ERA, which is essentially a layer of high explosive sandwiched between 2 metal plates designed to minimize the damage of explosive projectiles by detonating just prior to their impact. Pretty fancy, right? ERA was specifically designed to counter a range of advanced weaponry, including missiles and rockets carrying high explosive anti-tank warheads, as well as highly deadly sabot rounds, which separate after being fired and turn into a thin, fin-stabilized rod made of depleted uranium. Once a sabot round impacts an enemy tank, the kinetic force it creates while penetrating also creates a steam of molten metal that pours into the cabin with it. This instantaneously increases the temperature and pressure inside of the sealed turret, killing, or rather cooking, everyone inside. The T-90 also comes with a magnetic mine detection system that, when functioning properly, uses an electromagnetic pulse to disable mines before the tank can run over them. So then, what's the deal, you might be asking? Why aren't these extra fancy protection systems making the T-90s unstoppable? For one, these systems haven't performed so well against long-range anti-tank guided missiles. There was one report that stated a Ukrainian took out 2 T-90Ms back-to-back using an AT-4 anti-tank weapon. If that report is accurate, this would be a very impressive set of skills. The Swedish-made Saab AT-4, given to the Ukrainians by the US and Sweden, is a lightweight, shoulder-launched anti-armor weapon. However, despite delivering an 84mm projectile out to a range of 300 meters, this unguided weapon should not be effective against a T-90M's reactive armor, which the manufacturers claim is effective against not just low-speed rockets and missiles, but also tank rounds coming in at hypersonic speeds. There are, it seems, even more embarrassing ways to lose a tank, which Russia has also discovered recently. Apparently, a group of Russian technicians accidentally set fire to a T-72 they were attempting to repair. In the confusion, the ammunition on board caught fire and exploded, completely destroying the tank and damaging 2 others nearby. The loss of this tank and the 2 T-90Ms suggest that a more complex set of problems might be plaguing the Russian military. And this makes the actual durability and effectiveness of the T-90 more difficult to determine. Is the hyped T-90M any less vulnerable than earlier models? It's hard to tell when it's regularly being used without proper tactical or common sense. Another reason the T-90 was poorly conceived compared to other main battle tanks is that its underlying design is outdated. Ultimately, as we mentioned before, the T-90 is simply an improved version of the T-72. Essentially, the turret of the T-80 and the hull and drivetrain of the T-72 combined together and covered over with reactive armor. And because the T-90 is in its essence only an update, it retains all of the defects of its bargain-built older brothers. Its inherent shortcomings, leading to the apparent failure of the T-90's ultra-modern defensive systems, is one thing, but this tank has also been the victim of tactical incompetence and has regularly been rolled into impossible no-win situations. In modern warfare, advancing tanks are supposed to be supported by infantry, for the very purpose of suppressing enemy ground troops who might be using anti-tank weapons, like the AT-4. Deployed armor should also have artillery support, if only to help mitigate any long-range threats. Sending tanks forward without defensive support, as Russia has continued to do in Ukraine, makes them extremely vulnerable, especially to infantry units using shoulder-launched weapons. Mobile ground units, when allowed to get in close, can carry out ambushes at short range, which allows them to focus their attacks on a tank's more vulnerable target areas. A particularly vulnerable area for these tanks that's also been exposed by the creative fighting tactics being used in Ukraine is the roof. So it seems the T-90 has had some trouble with the anti-tank missiles that are fired from elevated positions and ultimately come down onto these vehicles from above. The T-90's 360-degree active protection system is supposed to protect from this sort of attack, and its failure to do so might suggest that this fancy new system isn't as infallible as first advertised. A range of other deficiencies came to light after the first T-90 was captured, intact, from the battlefield in Ukraine. With the tank now safely in their possession, military specialists from the Ukrainian Center for the Study of Captured and Prospective Weapons and Military Equipment were able to conduct an analysis of all internal equipment and armaments, and went on to publicly announce their findings in March of 2023. When, around the same time, another T-90A was captured, this one was apparently handed over to the US, also for the purpose of research. But when one of Russia's most modern pieces of armor was spotted on a trailer in Louisiana, then subsequently photographed, a debate surrounding the tank's unlikely appearance on American soil exploded on social media. It isn't fully known what the US ultimately had planned for the tank, but we do know what Ukraine did with theirs. They ripped it apart, literally and figuratively. Once the team of Ukrainian experts had completed their investigation, they claimed to have uncovered little more than an old T-72 hiding beneath the shell of widespread Russian propaganda, labeling Russia's new war machine an overall failure and not nearly the breakthrough the Kremlin had been all along claiming it to be. The team of engineers from the Center for the Study of Captured and Prospective Weapons and Military Equipment also noted that the well-praised automatic loader was largely the same design as could be found on the older T-72. The only major difference being that the ammo was now stored in a separate compartment outside the turret. This modification, however, created the complication of tankers having to fully exit the vehicle in order to load ammunition into the main compartment, which, to be done with any practical sense or relative amount of safety, would require that the tank leave the field of battle. Talk about taking yourself out of the fight. The center also reportedly discovered significant limitations concerning the T-90's B92S2F V12 diesel engine, which Ukrainian engineers claimed did not have sufficient power to reliably propel the vehicle, a claim that was supported by videos of T-90s getting stuck in the mud. They also noted that the highly praised Kalina computerized fire control system had incorporated in its design not only civilian electronic components, but some of Western origin, while other electronic components had been assembled without adhering to moisture control requirements, resulting in increased oxidation, shortened lifespan, and unexpected failure. But the embarrassment of Russian tank builders isn't the Kremlin's biggest problem here. If Ukraine persists in revealing the secrets and vulnerabilities of the allegedly advanced systems and technologies of the T-90, this could potentially create a serious financial challenge for Russia in the future. By giving other countries the information needed to produce their own, while simultaneously diminishing the hype surrounding the Russian-made T-90, sales are bound to diminish. And this is no small sum we're talking about. Russia has currently received a combined total of nearly $10 billion for exported T-90s from India and Algeria alone. but a fair amount of damage seems to have already been done. As reports of the T-90's mediocrity have continued to surface, many foreign companies that had previously signed contracts with Russia have swiftly cancelled those agreements. All these technological and mechanical shortcomings, though, are only part of the bigger story. The lack of success the T-90 has had on the battlefield in Ukraine cannot be truly understood without looking at the opposition they faced. It would be a disservice to Ukraine's ferocious troops to do otherwise. Combined with grit and determination born largely of national pride, Ukrainian forces have also received an impressive amount of anti-tank weaponry from the US, as well as other allies. From the US alone, Ukraine has received more than 10,000 Javelin anti-armor systems, 90,000 other anti-armor systems and munitions, 8,000 tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided TOW missiles, 35,000 grenade launchers and small arms, 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition and grenades, and a whole slew of laser-guided rocket systems, rocket launchers, and anti-tank mines. According to Washington's regularly updated list of wartime contributions, which includes 31 Abrams tanks, 45 T-72B tanks, 186 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 20 Mi-17 helicopters, dozens of combat drones, lots of state-of-the-art satellite communications equipment, and more than 100,000 sets of body armor and helmets, President Biden has provided nearly $44 billion in military assistance to Ukraine thus far. Weapons are a critical part of warfare, that's obvious, but without resourcefulness, they will only take a conventional force so far, which makes the new tactic Ukrainian forces have been using against Russian tanks that much more impressive. To go along with their already proven yet more traditional ambush maneuvers, they've also developed a highly creative yet simple way of utilizing landmines. Essentially, as a Russian mine plow clears a path through a known minefield, Ukrainian troops will wait for it to pass, then toss fresh mines onto the same path right in front and sometimes behind the trailing convoy, effectively littering the cleared corridor with new mines. The vehicles following the mine plow end up hitting these mines or run over the mines as they try to escape the trap. To execute this brazen new maneuver, the Ukrainians have been utilizing two different types of mines. One is the Soviet TM62, the other is the American Remote Anti-Armor Mine System, or RAM, of which the US has donated more than 30,000. The 21-pound TM62 is what you think of when you think of a traditional mine, basically a big metal disc packed with explosives and fitted with some sort of fuse. The RAM, on the other hand, is slightly different and consists of 9 mines that are 4 pounds each, stacked together in a hollow 155mm artillery shell. With practice, Ukrainian troops have found that a few well-aimed volleys can scatter scores of these, each with a magnetic fuse, across a relatively wide area. This tactic has been a big success recently, as armored vehicles have continued to roll in neat lines across the fields and forests between the Russian-occupied cities of Pavlivka and Volodar. And what often happens, after the lead tank hits a mine and explodes, the rest of the column attempts to scatter. Some vehicles try to go around the wrecked lead vehicle, only to hit a mine themselves. In these scenarios, even retreat is dangerous, as there might be fresh mines now scattered behind the column, littered across the very path it used to come through. In the past weeks, in the region surrounding Volodar, the Russians have lost 30 or more armored vehicles, including a few tanks, and it seems that well-placed mines have largely been the cause. To defeat these tactics and save a few of their prized T-90s, Russia will need, at minimum, better intelligence and a more flexible command and control strategy. In theory, the narrow TM62 minefields shouldn't be that hard to avoid if the opposing force was able to, let's say, organize 24-hour surveillance and a reliable means of disseminating information to its frontline forces. And Russia will need exactly that if they want to keep ahead of Ukraine's clearly savvy military engineers. But what do you think? Have the technical shortcomings of the Russian T-90 been the primary cause of its poor performance? Or are these tanks being utilized poorly and judged unfairly? Also, how might foreign military aid and Ukraine's improvised tactics be contributing to the loss of so many Russian tanks? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. This is Russia's next-generation tank, the T-14 Armata, the latest tank from a country that has long prided itself on its armored assets. The T-14 is supposed to be armed with all the latest modern weapons, gadgets, and protective armor, in an ensemble meant to be a clear break from Soviet-era tank conventions which stretch back to World War II's revered T-34. Russia sells the T-14 as being in a league of its own, with capabilities that exceed all tanks of foreign manufacture. Indeed, the tank and the chatter around it gave Western observers the chills for a while. However, this facade is probably not all it's cracked up to be. Here's why Russia's next-generation T-14 Armata sucks when it actually comes to winning wars. Work on the project began in 2010 under the label Object 195. The first basic model of the new tank was introduced in July 2012. The Kremlin publicly unveiled this model as the T-14 Armata at a Victory Day parade in 2015, and the tank is supposed to enter full service by 2024. The Armata has, however, suffered multiple delays throughout its brief history. Thus far, only a single T-14 has been spotted in Ukraine. The sighting came in the village of Mijinskaya in Luhansk Oblast on October the 8th. The unit may have been placed there to serve as a command tank for other Russian armored assets. The Russians may also be deploying the T-14 tank as a psychological operation to increase morale on their own side after having experienced embarrassing defeats, and to send a message to the Ukrainians that they have yet to best their top-line gear. But how top-line is the Armata really? Would it really make a difference in Ukraine and change Russia's ebbing fortunes if it were deployed in greater numbers? On the surface, the T-14 possesses formidable attributes. It has frontal base armor protection of over 900mm in combination with Malachit explosive reactive armor and the Afghani active protection system. If its armor system works as advertised, the T-14 should be able to take hits from any known tank munition, and with Ukraine's lack of advanced tanks, this could prove a problem should the Armata get deployed in large numbers. The T-14's armor is also supposedly resistant against handheld anti-tank weapons like the famous Javelin, which the Ukrainians have used to great effect against Russian armor in the war. The T-14 also boasts a separate self-contained crew capsule that is isolated from its magazine and specifically designed to protect the three-man operating team from anti-tank fire, maximizing its defensiveness and aiding its ability to act as a command unit. Other shielding mechanisms include active defense systems at the front of the vehicle to shoot down common anti-tank weaponry, such as RPGs. The tank also reportedly has stealth features, with its armor having a lower radar cross-section than other tanks in use. But that's not all. The Armata is a quick and maneuverable tank, with a top speed of 75 to 80 km/h in both forward and reverse modes. In contrast, most of Russia's widely used tanks can only achieve a top speed of 4 km/h while in reverse, making them easy to target with anti-tank fire. The T-14 has a remote-controlled turret that loads automatically, with a 45-round magazine. The standard gun is a 125mm 2A82-1M smoothbore, but it can be upgraded to a 2A83 152mm gun. Either type can also fire laser-guided missiles. The T-14's secondary weapons include the Cord 12.7mm machine gun or PKTM 7.62mm machine gun. The Armata's engagement range exceeds any Western tank, as it can hit targets up to 12 km away. Sounds incredible, right? Here's the thing though. All of these defensive and offensive features sound impressive, but Russia has proven that it isn't exactly a trustworthy source of information about its own capabilities. In reality, the T-14 has shown itself to be lacking so far, and not all is as it seems. The tank's problems stretch back to its debut, when one of them broke down and had to be towed away for repairs during a rehearsal for a military parade in Red Square in 2015, which would have been one of its first public showings. This proved only the first of many embarrassments. Often those shortcomings included not being able to pay for or manufacture the tank at scale. An impressive weapon means little if you cannot produce it in the numbers needed to shift the balance of power on the battlefield. That only one T-14 has been spotted in Ukraine after 9 months of war suggests a few problems for the Russians in actually using the tank. The T-14 has been plagued by numerous delays since its public debut in 2015. The Kremlin's initial plans to field 2,300 Armata tanks proved unaffordable, and Russia needed to settle for a much smaller total. The Russian armed forces expected the first batch of 9 in 2018, but the Kremlin moved the date back first to 2019 and then 2020. A 2020 report in The Diplomat stated that 132 Armatas would be delivered by 2022, but that has not happened either. It turns out that the company that manufactures the tank, Uralvagonzavod, also had its fair share of problems. The company is 87 billion rubles in debt and needed to cut the pay of its workforce by 21% between 2019 and 2020. These financial problems may be a reason why only 20 finished T-14s exist as of 2021. The Armata's frequent glitches and production delays delays came before the hefty sanctions the international community levied in retaliation for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Such sanctions will make it even more difficult for Russia to obtain the materials it will need to manufacture the T-14's advanced electronics, among other systems. The T-14 may have all the high-tech features that Russia claims it has, but even if all of it was true and it all worked, it means little if the Russians cannot deploy them on the battlefield. The next-generation tank also means little if it's too expensive and becomes a white elephant, which may be the reason why Russia has been hesitant to use the T-14 in Ukraine until now. The Ukrainians have proven excellent tank killers and capturers in this war. The prospect of the T-14 falling into enemy hands must make the Kremlin take pause, and if you're too scared of losing a weapon system to deploy it, it's not exactly a useful tool. Indeed, because Russia has been unable or unwilling to produce the T-14 Armata at scale, it has instead used its resources to upgrade its older arsenal of tanks, such as the T-72, T-80, and T-90A. There are other problems for the T-14 tank as well, ones which go beyond cost, manufacturing, and delivery. One of the reasons for the delays includes continual glitches in the T-14's software. These glitches came partly because of sanctions that the West imposed on Russia following its annexation of Crimea in 2014. Particularly, a major weakness inherent in the Armata is that its much-vaunted protective crew capsule cannot revolve like the gun turret can. The engineering arrangement means that the tank relies on optical systems and electronics to deliver visual information to the crew. That is not exactly ideal when you can't get your software right, and even if it were to check out, how would the crew react to their electronics being taken out during a battle? Speaking of systems failure, some American Abrams crews who are familiar with the T-14 were not impressed with what they saw. They questioned the emphasis of its supposedly modern auto-loading cannon. When speaking in a 2018 report for Business Insider, they asked what would happen if something goes wrong in the middle of a battle and the automated loader stopped working. How much work would it take to get the breach open and get down in there? Since the self-isolated crew capsule is separate from the turret, the answer is it could take a lot of work. As the United States has seen with the F-35s and other expensive modern systems, sometimes having the most cutting-edge technology means you sign up for a lot more things potentially going wrong, and if anything is true on a battlefield, many things will go wrong. No plan survives the first contact with the enemy. Even if the T-14's auto-loading system works perfectly, it faces another disadvantage. It is slow. Auto-loading may sound modern, but an American Abrams crew with a human loader can actually get shots off faster. They can usually fire their weapons in 5-second intervals at the maximum, and more often than not under 4. According to Sergeant Emmett Fulgham, a tank gunner with 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, who talked about the subject to the military publication Coffee or Die. In contrast, the T-14's auto-loader takes 10 seconds or more to load and fire, meaning that its prospective Western opponents can get 2 or 3 shots off for every one that the Armata gets. The Armata may have a longer range, but with such limited numbers and large load times, it may simply not be able to put enough fire down range to tilt the scale of a battle, especially when there will not be many Armatas to begin with. The Armata has supposedly seen limited action in the field, and results have not been encouraging. According to the reports in Chinese media, the T-14 underperformed in its subdued use in Syria. Chinese media blasted the Russians for promoting false combat conditions under which the tank took part, claiming there was no evidence for anything that they were saying. With such praise from his friends, Vladimir Putin must be wondering what his enemies think. For their part, rebel factions in Syria commented that they had not encountered the Russians' newest tank. Other information out of Syria suggests that the Armata's vaunted system of protection didn't work so well. Reporting from 2020 indicated that soldiers wielding anti-tank weapons hit 3 T-14s, with one of them being completely destroyed. If such reports are true, it is feasible that the Armata's defenses do not live up to the Kremlin's hype, and that advanced anti-tank systems like the American Javelin, British NLAW, and Swedish AT-4 could destroy it, even if the crew in their isolated capsule compartment manages to survive the impact to the tank's turret and magazine. Perhaps this is the reason that only one Armata has been definitively spotted in Ukraine. Another problem that the T-14 faces is that foreign countries, even ones Russia has long had arms deals with like China, India, and Middle Eastern nations, don't seem eager to buy it. Russia has tried to sell the T-14 abroad, but it has found no buyers. The lack of foreign interest leaves Russia even more cash-strapped in developing it, since weapon R&D is expensive and foreign investments help to make the final product pay for itself. For example, robust foreign purchases of the F-35 Lightning II helped the United States share the burden in developing that infamously expensive platform. However, with the seeming lack of interest for Russia to buy one of its own assets and its design problems, other countries don't seem too keen on purchasing the Armata. China even claims that its next-generation VT-4 tank is superior to the Armata. The T-14 Armata's problems are large enough to make the Kremlin reconsider its investment in it. Another tank design, which reportedly lost out to the Armata in the 2000s, called the Burlak, is now the subject of discussion in the Russian military. This tank is less revolutionary. Instead, it evolves on Russia's older tank technology to produce a vehicle nearly as good as the Armata. Whether the Burlak reemerges and spells the doom of the T-14 project remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: the T-14 shows us that appearances can be deceiving, and that most modern does not always mean most useful. But what do you think? Does the T-14 Armata have the potential to become the world's greatest tank? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Russia's Su-57, Putin's first stealth fighter in service since December 2022, has been through a rollercoaster of development woes and skepticism. Yet despite its impressive tech, doubts remain about its true capabilities, especially its stealthiness. So what's the deal with its long road to completion, and can it really slip under the radar like it claims? Let's dive in. Tom Cruise is no stranger to impossible missions. For several decades, perhaps with a bit of assistance from the Hollywood special effects department, he has been fighting bad guys in fast-moving action sequences on sea, land, and in the air. In 1986, in the film Top Gun, he piloted a state-of-the-art, fourth-generation US F-14 Tomcat against fictional Russian MiG-28s. In 2022, he returned to the cockpit of the by-now out-of-date F-14 to dogfight against fifth-generation advanced Russian fighters. Cruise, in the guise of ace fighter pilot Pete Mitchell, manages to shoot down 2 enemy aircraft. He downs one of them the old-fashioned way, with a burst of cannon fire. Another member of his squadron manages to account for another one. In this second version of the film Top Gun, the plane the movie directors chose to represent the bad guys was a real aircraft, the Russian Su-57 single-seat multi-role stealth fighter. Since its original maiden flight back in 2010, this is a plane so rarely seen in the skies that it might almost be a fictional aircraft. Ironically, if Maverick and his buddies had shot down 3 Su-57s in real life, that would have probably accounted for the entire Russian serviceable fleet of stealth fighters. Joking aside, Russia's Su-57 fighter is Russia's first attempt to join a very exclusive club of nations, those that can boast a stealth fighter within their air force. Information is always a little bit hazy around Russian military equipment. We think the Su-57 officially became operational in December 2020. Until then, it was only China and the United States that had stealth fighters. The Su-57 has had a painful and protracted birthing process that has spanned decades, cost billions of rubles, and seen 2 of the aircraft written off in accidents before it was operational. It may have been used in combat against Ukraine in the last couple of years, but we only have the claims of the Kremlin and little in the way of independent confirmation. But the Su-57 certainly seems to be a high-tech and capable aircraft, and Western analysts have been taking a keen interest in its development. So why has it taken so long to develop? And is it any good? And perhaps more to the point, is it stealthy? Before we get to that, let's start with what seemed to be a promising origin story. Founded by Pavel Sukhoi in 1939, the Sukhoi Design Bureau has developed a long and proud tradition of producing combat aircraft in the service of first the Soviet Union and then Russia. Sukhoi produced fighter and ground attack aircraft during the Second World War. From 1945 onwards, the company embraced the new challenges in technologies offered by the arrival of the jet engine, producing fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Sukhoi also branched out into civilian aircraft. In 2006, the Russian government merged several aircraft companies into the United Aircraft Corporation. Sukhoi was part of this merger, alongside Mikoyan, Tupolev, Ilyushin, and several other legendary Russian aircraft designers and manufacturers. And thus the development of the Su-57 began. Here's how it went down. Almost as soon as a new piece of high-technology military equipment comes into service, designers and planners are already looking ahead and thinking about its replacement. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was looking ahead for the next generation of combat aircraft to provide the fighters of the 1990s and beyond. The concept was to have an aircraft capable of a range of tasks, able to attack targets in the air, on the land, and at sea. Experimental projects were initiated, and some fell by the wayside amid cost increases and program delays. One fighter prototype only took to the air in 2000 and was, at that point, 9 years behind schedule. The Russian Defense Ministry started afresh and in 1999 released a new set of requirements for a fighter aircraft that could, for cost reasons, replace both the MiG-29 and the Su-27, both sizable fleets of aircraft. It was intended that the aircraft should be smaller than its predecessors as well, to fit in with limited budgets. The Sukhoi development team took part in the invitation to submit proposals. It came down to a competition between Sukhoi and MiG. In April 2002, Sukhoi was selected and invited to produce prototypes, with an intended flying trial date somewhere in 2007. At the time, the aircraft design had a prototype name of the T-50. Sukhoi themselves are speculated to have used the American F-22 Raptor as a baseline guide for their design of a stealth fighter. The Sukhoi aspiration was for a family of stealth aircraft to emerge out of the Su-57 design work. Because much of the technology was very new, as the design of the aircraft proceeded, other aircraft were used as testbeds for aspects of the T-50, such as the weapons bays, engines, and flight control systems. Sukhoi made use of their own Su-27 multi-role fighter for this, and even retained some of these innovations on the Su-27 to make an upgraded Su-27. This proved so successful that the Russian Defense Ministry bought this new Su-27 version and renamed it the Su-35. The Su-35 is actually quite similar to the Su-57, apart from the stealth aspect, which the Su-57 reportedly has and the Su-35 does not. The project started to come together. The basic design was approved in 2004, and this triggered the release of more Defense Ministry funding into the project. In August 2007, the Russian Air Force announced the development was complete and that trials would soon be starting. The Soviet Union and Russia have marketed their military hardware all over the world. A fifth-generation stealth fighter aircraft would be no exception. Getting a large overseas order early on would take the financial pressures of the Su-57 project. India had bought much Russian military equipment in the past and expressed very strong interest in acquiring the Su-57. There was talk of potential sales of 200 or 300 aircraft. A deal was signed between Russia and India in 2010. But this is where cracks literally started to emerge in the program. A dozen flying and non-flying prototypes had been produced. Although flight testing and the maiden flight were due to begin in 2007, the flights were delayed. There were problems with the engines, flying trials were pushed back to 2010, and when they did take place, it soon became apparent that the airframe structure had significant problems. Stress cracks were appearing after only a few flights. The Sukhoi designers scrambled to find solutions and had to implement some major design adjustments in order to reinforce the basic aircraft structure. In June 2014, one of the prototypes caught fire just after landing. Although the pilot escaped unharmed, the aircraft was written off. Some of the parts and components were cannibalized for use with the other prototypes. The original plan had been to start delivering production versions of the Su-57 from 2015. This clearly was not going to happen. The delivery date slipped to 2020. During these unforeseen difficulties, the Russian government began to reassess and reduce its purchasing plans for the aircraft. The Russian Defense Ministry would buy 52 Su-57s by 2020 and then another 150 by 2025. But the program remained troubled, as purchasing plans and delivery dates all fluctuated. After Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014 and the subsequent low-intensity conflict in eastern Ukraine fought by Russian-backed separatists and covert Russian forces, international sanctions began to impact on Russian finances. The Russian defense industry relied on importing high-tech Western electronics and other equipment. These important components became harder to access on the open market. Sanctions were to become even tougher when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. India started to back away from the big purchase order of Su-57s and in 2018 cancelled the deal completely. Large-scale production of what was a very expensive aircraft was now looking very doubtful. But in 2019, Russian President Vladimir Putin jumped in to tip the scales, perhaps even with his eye on a coming war with Ukraine. In May, the Kremlin released a statement that 76 Su-57s would be bought and would be delivered by 2028, but production of the aircraft remained slow. Reportedly, one was made in December 2020, and another 4 had emerged by the middle of 2022. Despite the problems, the aircraft had now flown publicly at airshows, and analysts had been able to take a look. The aircraft was light, maneuverable, and agile. Commentators were impressed. Marketing brochures and Kremlin official statements hyped up the capabilities, not least the fact that it was a stealth aircraft with long-range strike capability. But good intelligence analysts try not to take anything for granted. If it could do everything that the brochure advertised, the Su-57 would represent a very credible opponent for current US and NATO frontline fighter aircraft, such as the Eurofighter Typhoon, the F-22 Raptor, and the F-35 Lightning. But one former US pilot wryly observed, "Is it a current threat? Well, not now, because there is only one of them." Another ex-pilot observing the smooth takeoff and acrobatics of an Su-57 at an airshow was impressed but slightly dismissive of the fancy aerial display designed primarily to please the tourists. He was more interested in how the aircraft would perform with a full load of fuel and a heavy payload of weapons. Despite Putin's apparent faith in the aircraft, on December 24, 2019, the first official production-grade aircraft crashed while being delivered to an airbase. The pilot ejected and survived. The cause is unclear, but is believed to have been some form of control system malfunction. So what sort of capabilities have been advertised for the Su-57? The aircraft stats look impressive, reporting a speed of Mach 2 to 2.1 and a ceiling of 20,000 meters. A high fuel carrying capacity appears to give it a much longer range, 1,500 kilometers, just under 1,000 miles, than its Su-27 counterpart. It also has the option to fit an extendable refueling probe to further increase the range. Later production models are intended to receive a newly designed engine, the Isdalai 30, to deliver more power and performance. The Su-57 is capable of supercruise, maintaining flight speeds beyond Mach 1 without having to use high-fuel expensive afterburners. The Su-57 has 6 radars to enhance pilot situational awareness. The N036 Bielka radar has a range of 400 kilometers. The F-16, about to be received by Ukraine, only has a range of 300 kilometers. It can carry many different permutations of weapon types, missiles, cruise missiles, and bombs, enabling it to strike at ground, sea, and air targets. A GSH 30mm automatic cannon provides a small anti-air or air-to-ground attack capability. Apparently, hypersonic missiles are being designed with the Su-57 in mind. The infrared search and tracking system can handle multiple targets. But let's spend a little bit of time thinking about the main selling point for the Su-57, its stealth capability. Inevitably, these specialist skills are closely guarded state secrets, but we can make a few observations. A stealth aircraft is simply an aircraft that has been designed to make it harder for radar to hit the aircraft and bounce back to the radar receiver and produce a ping or a blip on the radar screen. This can be achieved with several careful shaping features to the plane's outline. The Su-57 aircraft has incorporated many measures indicative of stealth capability. The wing and control surfaces are carefully shaped and angled. For stealth missions, the weapons are carried in 4 internal weapons bays, rather than hanging off the outside of the aircraft, which would make the aircraft more radar visible. Large parts of the aircraft surface are treated with radar-absorbing material, RAM. A key search and track sensor faces backwards when not in use, with the forward edge treated with RAM. The pilot canopy has been prepared with a metal oxide coating to reduce the radar profile. Extra care has been paid to every aspect of the assembly of the aircraft. Every rivet has to be flush with the fuselage or otherwise concealed. When assessing an aircraft's stealth capability, the experts talk of a radar cross-section. They mean what aircraft profile is visible to a radar system. By one estimate, the Su-57's radar cross-section, or RCS, is 30 times smaller than that of the Su-27. But some Western analysts suggest that although the frontal radar cross-section may be reasonably effective, the profile from the rear looks to be less well concealed. This would mean that it's probably harder to pick up on the radar if it's coming straight at you, but it might be more visible from the side or the rear. A crucial selling point for military hardware is whether you can point to a credible track record of military success. The Su-57 does not have this. Or does it? It's actually quite difficult to give a definitive answer. The Russian Defense Ministry has claimed that the Su-57 has been used in action in Syria and in Ukraine. This is hard to verify, but let's take a look at what we do know. Our journey begins in Syria. In late February of 2018, 2 Su-57s reportedly landed at the Khmeimim military airbase on Syria's Mediterranean coastline. Khmeimim is directly adjacent to the Bashar al-Assad International Airport and, since 2015, has been effectively handed over to the Russians as part of their military operation in support of the Assad regime. It's well defended by Russian military personnel and air defense systems, and is a key logistics and accommodation node for Russian forces. The base has come under attack from shelling and drones in 2018. The Su-57s came accompanied by other aircraft, including Su-25s and 35s. Depending on the route taken, this could have been a flight of 1,000 kilometers or so, providing a good flight trial in its own right. It's possible that another couple of Su-57s also arrived at Khmeimim a few days later. What the Su-57s did there is unclear. It may simply have been a public relations exercise to demonstrate Russian capabilities and global reach. The aircraft were only there for a few days. After they departed, the Russian government made reference in March to Su-57 combat trials in Syria and claimed on 25th of May that an Su-57 had fired a cruise missile in combat. Later that year, the Russian Defense Ministry released footage of the Su-57s in flight and stated that 10 flights had taken place. It seems highly likely that the Su-57s dipped their toes into the Syrian conflict, but overall, this looks more like a PR stunt than a serious military deployment. Okay, but what about Ukraine? Russian claims that the Su-57 has been active during the invasion of Ukraine have been more persistent, but equally difficult to prove. Although it might seem a bit of a no-brainer that the Russian military would want to use their best aircraft in a large-scale war on their border, using the Su-57 over Ukraine would be fraught with military and reputational dangers. According to estimates, there are perhaps 10 to 15 Su-57 aircraft in total. It's fair to assume that not all of these would be operationally ready at any one point in time. This amounts to a very small potential strike force, and one that could not realistically afford to lose more than one or two in combat. Multiple Russian sources started claiming that the Su-57 was used in action during the war, from 2 or 3 weeks after the start of the invasion. On 22nd of June 2022, Russian state media referred to the Su-57 combat operations in relation to Ukraine. On the 5th of November 2023, Russian media claimed that the Su-57s had been active over Luhansk, a region of Russian-controlled eastern Ukraine. Perhaps more credibly, the British Ministry of Defence Intelligence Group have assessed that the Su-57 has almost certainly been used in the war. Okay, so what could this mean? The Russian Air Force has suffered catastrophic losses during its invasion of Ukraine. According to plausible estimates, well over 300 aircraft from a Russian Air Force operational strength pre-war of around 900 aircraft. The Ukrainian air defense system has greatly improved during the conflict and now presents a very effective shield against Russian aerial encroachment. This looks likely to have caused the Russian Air Force to limit the amount of aircraft it risks to actually fly over Ukrainian territory. It is likely that US and NATO intelligence-gathering aircraft operating over NATO or international airspace in Eastern Europe are scooping up as much information as possible regarding Russian air deployment activities and operations and relaying this to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. Many Russian air attacks are now conducted from Russian aircraft firing long-range missiles from Russian airspace. But even this does not make them entirely safe. Ukrainian air defense weapons include the Patriot, which has a range of 50 to 100 miles. Drones and other missiles also put Russian aircraft at risk on their bases inside Russia. So it's likely that Russia is remaining highly cautious with the Su-57 over Ukraine, not wishing to overplay their hand and expose it to undue risk. From what we've seen so far, the Su-57 is being used to undertake just enough aerial activity to be able to claim operational experience, but not enough to use it in a serious way that might knock out key Ukrainian military targets by using its stealth capability. If an Su-57 crashed in Ukraine, it would be a major propaganda blow for Russia and potentially a rich source of technological and tactical intelligence information made available to the Ukrainians and their Western allies. The views from the Ukrainian military suggest they certainly do not rule out the possibility that the Su-57 has been deployed in some way. One Ukrainian colonel observed that it's hard to identify specific aircraft types from the radar screen. The Su-25 and Su-35 can conduct similar non-stealth attacks with a similar profile. The colonel may know a little more than he's letting on. Perhaps the only real proof that a Russian stealth fighter was operating over Ukraine would be if a Ukrainian ground target suddenly exploded and the Ukrainians were at a complete loss to explain who had done it. That would be the perfect demonstration of a stealth attack. Conversely, however, if a Russian stealth attack was seen on the radar and easily intercepted, the Su-57's credibility would be instantly blown. So the question is, does Mr. Putin feel lucky? One thing's for sure, it's been a troubled path for Sukhoi's 5th-generation stealth fighter, and unfortunately for Russia's Su-57 program, it looks to be having very similar problems to the Russian T-14 next-generation main battle tank program, which we covered in one of our previous episodes. Both projects have struggled with design issues, have little to show for several decades of effort, and are now struggling with funding, technology, and a lack of crucial overseas sales. There are very few, only handfuls really, of the equipment known to be in existence, and no convincing demonstrations that either the aircraft or the tank are operationally ready in any meaningful sense. But work is still ongoing. Sukhoi is developing an Su-57 upgrade, known as the Su-57M. Flight trials of the Su-57M reportedly took place in 2022. There has been talk of a smaller naval version capable of landing on an aircraft carrier, but Russia does not have a viable carrier force at present. Perhaps of more immediate interest, in July 2021 there was reporting that a two-seater variant of the Su-57 was being built. This was described as a training version, but also something that might provide for a weapons officer to operate unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. Drone technology is causing something of a revolution in military affairs, due in large part to the innovations emerging from the Ukrainian battlefield. This is definitely something to keep an eye on. There is little concrete evidence that the international arms community have been wowed by the arrival of the Su-57. Although international sanctions are unlikely to shut down the Su-57 program, lack of critical technology, funds, and buyers will likely continue to restrict the forward progress of the Su-57 project. Potential sales opportunities still look limited. Brazil dropped out in 2013, preferring to buy the Swedish Gripen and build it in Brazilian factories. India cancelled its deal with Russia over 5 years ago and is looking to build its own homegrown stealth fighter. Turkey was briefly interested. In 2019, an Su-57 turned up at a Turkish technology display in Istanbul, but announced in early 2020 that it too was now planning to build a homegrown stealth fighter. Algeria may receive some in a few years' time, and Iraq has expressed interest, but they will probably be watching Ukraine closely for evidence of the much-promoted stealth capability. But not all technological innovations leap straight from the drawing board and into a fully functioning and successful piece of equipment. We suggest that it would be too simplistic to write off the Su-57. It is a light, powerful, and agile aircraft with significant capabilities beyond other current Russian combat aircraft. And some of the new design and technological features that emerged from Sukhoi's extensive development efforts seem to have cascaded down to the benefit of other Russian fighter systems. So perhaps we need to wait and see what happens later this year. F-16 fighters have been offered to the Ukrainian Air Force by Denmark and Norway. These will replace the aging Ukrainian MiG-29 and Su-27 fighters. Ukrainian pilots are already being trained on F-16s, and we may well see them take to the skies over Ukraine even as soon as this summer. But what do you think? Is it possible the Russian Air Force is holding back its small Su-57 fleet in anticipation of a conflict with American aircraft technology? This would suddenly take us beyond a Hollywood movie and into a real contest between American 4th-generation aircraft and Russian 5th-generation. Is this likely to happen? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The Chinese military is one of the largest militaries on planet Earth, spending an incredible $293 billion in 2021 on defense. They rank second in the world, behind the United States. Coming in second here is impressive enough. If you know anything about Uncle Sam, then you know they won't be outspent when it comes to the military. The Chinese military is officially known as the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, and it consists of 5 service branches: the Ground Force or Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Rocket Force, which handles all kinds of ballistic, nuclear, and other missiles, and the Strategic Support Force, which deals with space, cyber, electronic, and political warfare. Highly trained, motivated, and armed with an arsenal of deadly weapons, they are truly a formidable fighting force. However, as the world saw with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, having a massive army and all the shiny weapons you can ask for doesn't guarantee success. So how does the PLA stack up against the rest of the world? What does history tell us about their level of preparedness, and how would they fare if a real war were to break out? Before we delve deeper into the current capabilities and strategies of the PLA, it's essential to take a step back in time. How did the PLA evolve into the formidable force we see today, and what historical events shaped its development? The journey begins with the PLA's inception on August 1, 1927, during the Nanchang Uprising, a landmark moment that ignited the Chinese Civil War. It was in the crucible of this war and the subsequent conflicts that followed where the PLA honed its skills and strategies. Throughout the 1930s, the Communist PLA and the Nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek clashed across China in a brutal struggle, a conflict that resulted in millions of casualties. Understanding this tumultuous history is key to comprehending the PLA's current form and function. One of the most pivotal events was known as the Long March, when the Communist forces primarily commanded by Mao Zedong found themselves in a difficult position, facing certain encirclement and defeat. Mao took his forces on a 5,600-mile march across China to another communist stronghold. A fraction of his forces survived the march, but it cemented Mao as a living legend among the Chinese. His leadership and bravery gave the PLA the motivation they needed to stay in the fight. In 1937, however, hostilities were mostly put on hold when Imperial Japan invaded China. The two sides officially formed the Second United Front and decided to deal with the most apparent threat, the Japanese, before resuming the fraternal bloodshed. During World War II, the PLA played a pivotal role in the Allied resistance against Japan. They had very few technological advantages, very few armored units, poor weaponry, and no real training, but they persisted nonetheless. Chinese resistance would continually infuriate and demoralize the Japanese invaders. They employed a wide range of guerrilla tactics and were an extremely useful ally of the United States and British forces. Once World War II ended in 1945, the PLA and Kuomintang went right back to killing each other. The second phase of the Chinese Civil War ran from 1945 until 1949, and again resulted in millions of casualties and untold levels of destruction. The PLA proved they had what it took to win, however, as they won the hearts and minds of the Chinese people and proved far more capable and competent at governing than their nationalist brethren. Finally, in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists suffered defeat after defeat, lost control over the country, and retreated to Taiwan. Even though they did not admit defeat, the war was over. Mao, the Communist Party, and the PLA had won, and their victory was the cornerstone in establishing the People's Republic of China. The celebrations were short-lived, however, as China joined the Cold War on the side of the Soviet Union. The skyrocketing tensions eventually erupted into incredible levels of violence again, this time against the United States and its allies. China joined the rapidly escalating Korean War on October 19, 1950, when the PLA crossed the Yalu River to support their North Korean allies. It was this force that was temporarily renamed the People's Volunteer Army. The logic being that using the word volunteer was implying a less aggressive stance on behalf of the Chinese government, meaning that the troops were there as volunteers out of a sense of duty to their Korean comrades. Not sure the rebranding made a difference to the men on the ground, whichever side they fought for. Once the Chinese forces crossed the Yalu, they swept through North Korea, pushing back UN and US forces until it came to a head at a place called Chosin Reservoir. This battle is infamous for its ferocity, horrendous weather conditions, as well as the overall resilience and bravery of the men who fought there. With temperatures dropping to as low as -38 Fahrenheit, frostbite was rampant and many men were pushed to their breaking point. The Chinese forces here had a variety of weapons and equipment. Some were left over from the Japanese and Kuomintang troops, while others were scavenged from fallen Americans or provided by their Soviet allies. This lack of continuity presented an interesting logistical challenge for their supply lines, but the PLA persisted nonetheless. Most of their weapons were small arms such as rifles, submachine guns, light machine guns, grenades, and mortars. The PLA did not have much in the way of heavy weapons such as artillery or air support, and what they did have usually came from the Soviets. The greatest resource the PLA had at this point was its manpower. During the battle, they employed rapid flanking and infiltration tactics aimed at maximizing their numerical advantage, similar to what the Soviets did during World War II. The thinking was that if you threw enough men at a numerically inferior position, eventually they would overwhelm it, or the Americans would run out of ammunition and be surrounded. Accounts from the battle describe seeing wave after wave of Chinese troops attacking US and UN positions with grim determination to fight for every foot of ground. These tactics saw success, but were always accompanied by staggering casualty rates. Battling against the enemy as well as the elements, the Chinese troops and their North Korean allies eventually captured a large part of the battlefield. However, they paid for it with a tremendous amount of blood, with the true winner of the battle still being debated today. Chosin had proven to the PLA, as well as the world, that the Chinese military was not a backwater force of ill-equipped peasants. While they may not have had the best equipment, they used what they had to deadly effect. One thing was clear, the PLA was becoming a modern military force capable of taking on the UN and the United States. The Chinese-Soviet relationship meant that the PLA would continue to receive weapons, training, and guidance from their Russian counterparts as the Cold War escalated. After the Korean War, the PLA continued its march toward modernization through a series of smaller conflicts and proxy wars. With the death of the Communist Party leader Mao Zedong in 1976, China began even more campaigns to modernize the PLA and level the playing field with the rest of the world. From 1975 to today, the PLA has undergone a tremendous change and has become one of the world's most formidable militaries, at least on paper. The two most recent examples of the PLA's combat experience illustrate how far they have come and how far they have to go. Since 1975, these two examples are the only times the PLA has seen legitimate combat, and what happened in each speaks volumes about where the PLA stands today. In 1979, China and Vietnam fought a war now known as the Sino-Vietnamese War. This dispute between neighbors started as a response to Vietnam's invasion and occupation of their neighbor Cambodia. Vietnam set out to put an end to the particularly murderous and Chinese-backed Khmer Rouge regime. The Khmer Rouge had been in power since their victory over the Cambodian government in 1975. From 1975 to 1979, the Khmer Rouge conducted widespread genocide on the Cambodian people. When the dust settled, between 1.5 to 3 million people had been murdered, which at this time was a quarter of the Cambodian population. Vietnam did not like what was going on across their western border and liked it even less when the Khmer Rouge soldiers attacked across the Vietnamese border repeatedly. This back and forth went on for a few years, but it exploded on Christmas Day, December 25, 1978, when Vietnam decided to invade Cambodia. Vietnamese forces overthrew the Khmer Rouge government in just 2 weeks and installed their own puppet government. Seeing as the Khmer Rouge had been backed by the Chinese government was very angry and vowed to retaliate. This retaliation started on February 17, 1979, and lasted for about a month. PLA forces overran the northern Vietnamese border and gained large amounts of territory quickly. The northern part of Vietnam saw heavy fighting and tremendous casualties on both sides. Most of the fighting took place in the provinces of Cao Bang, Lao Cai, and Lang Son. The Vietnamese tried to avoid direct confrontations, instead opting for what had been their bread and butter for decades, guerrilla warfare. The PLA force that they faced had not seen real combat since the early 1950s, and was a little rusty. The weapons and vehicles they used were outdated or not up to the task. Their soldiers were mostly untested and green. The Vietnamese, on the other hand, had been fighting continually since World War II and had mostly modern weapons. The fighting raged until March 16, 1979, with both sides claiming victory. China claimed it had won a victory and had opened the road to Hanoi, basically saying that they could have taken the capital, but they just didn't want to. The Vietnamese forces remained as an occupying force in Cambodia and claimed that they had won by repelling the PLA forces and forcing them to withdraw. With thousands upon thousands dead and nothing really gained by either side, things returned to normal and nothing had really changed. For the PLA, although not much had been gained, they realized quickly that to be a competitive military in a fast-paced world, they needed to up their game and continually improve. This served as a wake-up call and ego check. From the end of the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979 all the way until 2016, the PLA had a few engagements, but nothing of substance. The next time they saw significant combat came in 2016, when they were part of a UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan. This conflict was the first test of the PLA's combat capabilities for the first time in 4 decades and served as an indication of the combat readiness and effectiveness of the PLA. China committed combat troops to the UN for the first time in 2015, a major divergence from their long-held stance of no foreign intervention. Since 2000, China had steadily increased their military aid to the UN and in early 2015 sent 700 combat soldiers to South Sudan. The Chinese government did not undertake this mission simply out of the goodness of their heart, however, as the Chinese government has significant financial interests in Sudanese petroleum. Say what you will, but I challenge you to find any government that does things solely to help people and not for some ulterior motive. Glass houses, folks, glass houses. In 2016, the peacekeeping soldiers of the PLA were responsible for the security of a large section of the South Sudanese capital of Juba. Due to decades of rampant violence, there were over 37,000 displaced civilians in and around the capital. The Chinese soldiers here were tasked with protecting these civilians in official UN camps. The camps themselves had very little in terms of protection against an assault by combat-hardened troops backed by artillery and tanks. These camps were more refugee camps than they were military redoubts, and that mistake would be costly. Protected mainly by barbed wire fences, sand-filled HESCO boxes, wooden guard towers, and chain-link fences, the Chinese UN troops were not in a good situation. To make matters worse, two different and warring armies were converging on Juba. One army had the current president at the helm, and the other army was commanded by the former vice president. In terms of strength estimates, no one is sure of the number of government troops present, but the generally accepted number of rebel troops was around 1,400. On July 8th, both armies attacked the city and the UN-run camps. To no one's surprise, the two armies observed no rules of engagement and attacked everyone they came across. A widespread campaign of looting and violence commenced, with the civilians stuck in the crossfire, looking to the UN soldiers to do the exact thing that they were there to do and what they are named for: keep the peace. The Chinese peacekeepers were completely outgunned, outnumbered, and overwhelmed. They fought as best as they could, but only really had light squad-level weapons and a handful of armored troop carriers. As a result, the Chinese troops were forced to retreat further into the camps and set up a last stand. The civilians caught up in this madness were brutally killed, tortured, and forced to endure other unspeakable horrors. In addition to this, a UN aid warehouse was raided and emptied of its food and medical supplies. This aid was being directly used to help the refugees of war and was estimated to be worth a total of $30 million and enough food to help 200,000 people for over a month. The Chinese soldiers did the best they could, fighting back against a superior force. They did successfully deter assaults into the heart of the camps and help defend the 9,000 civilians sheltering there. After 3 days of fighting, countless civilians, militiamen, and 2 Chinese soldiers were dead. The Chinese soldiers died when a rocket-propelled grenade, or RPG, hit an armored troop carrier near them. The troop carrier's armor is designed more for deflecting landmines than stopping high-explosive rockets. In the immediate aftermath, all anyone cared about was who to point the finger at for this catastrophic failure of the UN's mission. The UN released several scathing reports claiming that the Chinese soldiers had failed to follow orders, abandoned their posts, and ultimately contributed to the failure. One analyst even went as far as to claim that Chinese soldiers are risk-averse and aren't willing to take the aggressive action necessary to win the fight. The Chinese government obviously refuted these claims, stating that the UN rules of engagement and subsequent policies regarding combat severely limited the soldiers in what they could actually achieve and the equipment they could use. They claimed that the UN kept the soldiers in a defensive posture that put them at a disadvantage. What they are saying is that the Chinese peacekeepers were not put into a position to be successful. There was also a high level of confusion here, as there was no centralized command. Chinese troops received sometimes conflicting orders from multiple officers, often from different nations. As with most arguments, the truth is somewhere in the middle. Before this, the PLA had not seen real combat since 1979, which means that any officers with combat experience would be well into their 60s. Not ideal. Training is great but can only go so far. No one knows how they will react when live rounds are flying too close for comfort, so it should not surprise anyone that the Chinese troops here tried their best but simply did not have enough field experience to make a difference. It also didn't help that they were outnumbered and outgunned. If they had their own equipment and vehicles, would it have changed the outcome? We can only speculate. Either way, it was an unmitigated disaster. What happened here was like if the Yankees played a single A team and got blown out by 10 runs. So while this battle makes the PLA's lack of real combat experience at every level glaringly apparent, it's also a critical failure on the part of the UN to adequately arm and prepare these men for the reality of the situation. Where does the PLA stand today? As of the production of this video, the PLA has about 2 million active duty troops with another 500,000 in reserve. Of those 2 million active duty troops, around 700,000 of them are conscripts, which isn't ideal for morale. Those conscripts go out to serve on 2-year enlistments. As discussed earlier, these troops are spread out across the 5 branches of the service, as well as with various auxiliary and police units. The PLA has a variety of weapons at its disposal. The main infantry rifles issued to its troops are the QBZ-95 and QBZ-191, which fire a 5.8 x 42mm round. In terms of sidearms, they utilize the OSZ-92, which fires a 5.8 x 21mm DAP-92. For a bit of a bigger bang, they have the PF-89 unguided anti-tank rocket launcher. For heavy weapons, the PLA boasts a large contingent of armor that theoretically rivals its Western counterparts. The ZTZ-99A main battle tank and ZBD-04A infantry fighting vehicle are great examples of this. While they've not seen combat directly, they have all the tools necessary to be deadly. The Navy of the PLA is considered one of the most, if not the most powerful navy in the world, with a battle force of 350 ships. For comparison, the US Navy has around 290 ships in its battle force. In terms of firepower, PLA Navy is extremely formidable as well, even outpacing the US Navy as per a 2016 study. The PLA Air Force is impressive as well, with 400,000 service members and 3,500 aircraft. They boast an arsenal of modern aircraft including the formidable Chengdu J-20. In terms of combat experience, not much has changed since the debacle of 2016. The only PLA officers or enlisted men with actual combat experience would be the ones who are still alive following the Sino-Vietnamese War, or one of the few who were involved in the Battle of Juba in 2016. Either way, not a lot of tried and true combat wisdom can be passed down to the lower ranks, and that's not what you want when you're gearing up for war. The best the PLA can do is train as realistically as possible. So that being said, what kind of training do they receive? All members of the PLA, when they initially enlist, are taken through basic training, similar to almost all other militaries on the planet. After that, they continue to more specialized training. In recent years, the Chinese government and high-ranking PLA officers have acknowledged that the lower ranks, and especially the conscripts, have not been receiving enough adequate training to prepare them for the task ahead. To fix this, they have stagnated conscription cycles so that they can afford to give units more substantial training and get them as prepared as possible for their new roles. As they say, practice makes perfect, and the PLA takes that one to heart. They drill relentlessly every summer, doing large-scale mock combat operations and try to get as close to the real thing as they possibly can. This includes the use of virtual reality systems, which allow the soldiers, sailors, and airmen to train in realistic scenarios without risk of injury. In 2023, the PLA focused on enhancing its integrated combat and rapid response capabilities. This means that they are working on efficient communication and coordination between the different branches of the PLA as they respond to a variety of external threats. Looking toward the future, China will continue to train relentlessly as global tension continues to mount. In regard to its hostile relationship with its neighbor Taiwan, the PLA continues to conduct military exercises and training in preparation for the likely amphibious invasion. It's no secret that China wants Taiwan brought back into the fold, but how they plan to actually achieve that is anyone's guess. While the fallout from this invasion would be an international catastrophe, the results of such a move is not clear. Taiwan is preparing as well and has turned the island into a fortress with hidden aircraft hangars, surface-to-air missiles, and enough machine gun nests to make anyone think twice. The Chinese government and subsequently the PLA have an increasing interest in the resources of Africa. As the market for the resources and the energy produced here become more valuable, it will be more important than ever for Chinese interests to be protected. It's really a question of when more PLA troops will be stationed there, not if. So all in all, the People's Liberation Army looks great on paper. It has everything you can want in a modern military: thorough training, advanced weapons, impressive armor, and ships. The one thing it lacks, that's so crucial to success, is combat experience. None of their enlisted men, except for some who might have been at Juba, have any experience getting shot at. For the officers, the only ones with tangible experience are well past fighting age or unlucky enough to have participated in Juba alongside their men. All the best weapons in the world aren't going to mean a thing if the soldiers using them don't have the experience to use them effectively while under fire. While the PLA could be an incredible fighting force when things heat up, all we can do now is speculate. Until the bullets start flying, there's no telling how they'll perform. So while the world holds its breath watching what will happen between China and Taiwan, the actual combat effectiveness of the PLA is going to be a topic of debate. As always, if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know what you thought in the comments as well. Now go and check out why China's military is a paper tiger, or click this other video instead. Russia has had many failures in Ukraine, but its naval shortcomings are likely the most humiliating. Can Putin find a way out of this constant humiliation? Here's the scoop. Before the war, experts were worried that Russia's Black Sea Fleet would help it to overwhelm Ukrainian resistance. For example, they feared that Russian ships stationed in Crimea would launch missiles into Ukraine free of retaliation. They also dreaded the possibility that the Black Sea Fleet would assist in Russian amphibious operations, especially in an attack on Odessa, the third largest city in Ukraine. The success of such an operation would completely cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea and leave it as a landlocked rump state. In the earliest days of the war, these experts watched Odessa and the Black Sea Fleet closely. Their attention was probably better focused elsewhere, because Russia's navy was, much like everything else in its military before the war, all talk and no show. Far from achieving naval supremacy in the war, Russia's navy has instead been effectively contained by Ukraine. What does this turn of events say about the Russian navy? In fact, the disaster did not come as a surprise to some experts, who had noted the decline in Russian naval capability ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. In this video, we'll take a look at the rather dilapidated state of Russian naval power. Ever since the days of Peter the Great in the early 18th century, Russia has aspired to become a sea power, often going to war to secure favorable coastline and ports. Unfortunately for Moscow, geography is its greatest enemy in its quest for naval parity with other great powers. Most of Russia's ports freeze over in the winter. Others, such as those in the Baltic and Black Seas, are contained within choke points. This geostrategic weakness has proven to be a big challenge for Russia historically, and the same is true for its war in Ukraine. The 1936 Montreux Convention regarding the regime of the Straits permits Turkey to bar warships from passing through the Dardanelles and Bosporus during wartime, cutting off transit between the Black and Mediterranean seas. Turkey invoked the convention's wartime provisions for the first time a few days after Russia initiated its so-called special military operation. The invocation meant that Russia could not reinforce its Black Sea Fleet, and as a result, Russia's naval brass became much more careful about deploying its existing ships. Such caution helped to ensure that the Russian army and navy would prove incapable of properly supporting each other throughout the war. The situation in Ukraine is only the latest example of geography getting in the way of Russia's quest for naval power. However, the Russian navy has far deeper problems. Command structure is one such problem. The Russian navy has no single command, making it difficult for Moscow to design and implement a comprehensive naval strategy and plan for new programs or updates to existing ones. Russia's navy has also suffered from a shortage of money, and much of the money that's been devoted to it has become misallocated due to corruption. Before the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's naval problems were getting more obvious. The fleet size has continually shrunk. Older ships are often taken to the scrapyard before newer ones can replace them. Because of this, Russia is slowly but steadily losing its naval presence in the Arctic, a region that China, with its expanding navy, is increasingly interested in, and even the Caspian Sea, where other post-Soviet countries are building their fleets. Russia's navy is aging too. The fall of the Soviet Union also caused the fall of much of the Russian shipbuilding industry. The end of the Cold War led to an end in the demand for many of the naval projects the Soviet Union had once required, atrophying the shipbuilding industry further. Skilled workers retired or had to find other jobs. Institutional experience began to evaporate. Important manufacturing equipment decayed. The shipbuilding industry was also partitioned as a result of the collapse. For example, much of the infrastructure that created the engines for Russia's warships wound up in Ukraine, since that is where much of them were built in Soviet times. As of November 10, 2023, the Russian Navy has a total of 265 fleet units, and the World Directory of Modern Military Warships ranks it third in capability behind the United States and Chinese navies. Russia has 185 fleet core units, such as destroyers, frigates, and corvettes, 58 submarines, 21 amphibious assault units, and 1 aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov. However, the Admiral Kuznetsov is indicative of Russia's deeper naval problems, so it's a case worth exploring. The aircraft carrier has been in dry dock for repairs since 2018, with the ship supposedly set to return to action in 2024. The repairs have been plagued by accidents and corruption. In 2019, a serious fire broke out. 2 years later, the Director General of the Murmansk shipyard, where the repairs were taking place, was arrested on suspicion of embezzling rubles equivalent to about $600,000. Only one example of the widespread corruption in the Russian Navy we've mentioned before. Even if it were repaired and returned to action in 2024, the Admiral Kuznetsov would not help to change the situation in Ukraine for Russia's forces because it cannot be moved to the Black Sea. The Admiral Kuznetsov is also not a state-of-the-art aircraft carrier. Although it was built in the 1980s, which was around the same time as many of the Nimitz-class carriers in the US Navy's fleet, it does not operate with a modern catapult system like they do. Instead, it uses the STOBAR, short takeoff but arrested recovery method. This means that it cannot launch its planes as rapidly as America's aircraft carriers, making it a less capable asset in power projection for Russia. The Admiral Kuznetsov is not the only less-than-modern ship in the Russian fleet. The Russian Navy's combined median hull age is 30 years. In comparison, the median hull age in the United States Navy is 23.3 years. At first glance, this would not seem too far behind, and it's true that the United States Navy has been collecting aging vessels, but as we will see shortly, America can fully replenish its fleets over a reasonable time. Russia has much deeper difficulties on its hands. When they have seen action, Russia's antiquated naval vessels have experienced problems in Ukraine. The most famous example came in the sinking of the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, in April 2022. Despite the Moskva's being an air defense cruiser, it sank when it got hit by a pair of Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles. Since the attack, observers have wondered how the Moskva's S-300F and 9K-33 OSA air defense missiles, its close-in 30mm cannons, chaff, decoys, and electronic warfare systems could have all failed to prevent the attack. Meanwhile, after getting hit, the Moskva did not prove survivable. It was a 40-year-old ship whose fire-extinguishing systems were outdated. Ukraine has also frequently used drone boats to damage or destroy Russian ships. On November 10th, Ukraine released footage of the drones at it again, attacking Russian landing ships. Footage showed at least one of them on fire in the water after an impact. Russia's navy has proven incapable of adapting to the demands of the war in Ukraine, and it appears that it will not be able to do so anytime soon. The sinking of the Moskva and other naval difficulties was a predictable result for some Russian military watchers who had been complaining that their country's fleet was aging poorly. Prior to the war, Putin had claimed that improving the Russian Navy's combat abilities was a priority of his. However, economic and logistical difficulties got in his way. Although Russia's defense spending increased under Putin, Russia has often lacked the manufacturing ability to modernize its armed forces. This lack of capacity would not be new or only confined to the Navy. Russia proved unable to manufacture the T-14 Armata tank or Su-57 Felon fighter jet in large numbers prior to the war. In many respects, the naval problems are worse, because the Soviet Union's industrial institutions were never adequately replaced after they shrunk or vanished. Prior to the invasion, Russia had attempted to build new guided missile frigates of the Admiral Grigorovich class for its Black Sea Fleet, but sanctions following Russia's unilateral annexation of Crimea prevented this from happening. In an irony, Russia needed engines made in Ukraine to propel these ships. In 2019, Russia had hoped to add 14 more of the supposedly stealth Admiral Grigorovich-class ships to its fleet, but only had the engines required for 2 of them. Russia tried to develop domestic gas turbine engines as a replacement for the engines Ukraine denied it, but has not yet begun production. In 2019, NPO Saturn, the Russian company tasked with manufacturing the engine for the new frigate, claimed that it had got its initial orders from the Ministry of Defense. However, sources quoted by Reuters at the time said that there was no guarantee about how many engines the MOD would actually buy. Ukrainian observers said that it would be at least 5 years before production of these engines began. Much more severe sanctions imposed since then will make the problem of building new ships for Russia's surface fleet that much steeper. Russia has also had a problem maintaining its existing surface fleet. The fire on the Admiral Kuznetsov during repairs in 2019 was only one of the many accidents and episodes of mismanagement that the Russian Navy is prone to. For example, the Kara-class cruiser Kerch caught fire in 2014 under mysterious circumstances. A shipyard fire in 2016 damaged a new minesweeper that was under construction too. And if you thought the repairs to the Admiral Kuznetsov were slow, consider that the Soviet-era nuclear-powered cruiser Admiral Ushakov had been idle for nearly 2 decades before 2019, when the Russian naval brass finally decided to scrap it. Russia originally had plans to modernize all of its Kirov-class nuclear-powered cruisers, but in 2012 announced that it would do so on only one of them, the Admiral Nakimov, scrapping the others. This is all part of a trend. The 265 fleet units in the Russian Navy as of 2023 is a sharp decline from the 360 ships that American observers believed it had on hand in 2019. That year, Russia saw the delivery of 23 new surface ships, a fact which brought a lot of fanfare in its homeland. However, just 7 of these were armed combatants. The others were small missile corvettes that displaced no more than 2,000 tons of water. Displacement matters. One of the more accurate ways to measure the true power of a country's navy is through its combined tonnage. Heavier ships can not only carry more weapons and absorb more damage, but they can also stay at sea for longer. For example, the United States builds large warships because they often need to travel thousands of miles from ports in the homeland to reach their destinations and perform their worldwide missions. Heavier ships can carry more fuel and other supplies. Lighter ships are more vulnerable, less powerful, and can stay at sea for a limited amount of time. This is one of the reasons why American experts are not overawed by China having the world's largest navy by total vessels. Most of the Chinese ships are light and would fare poorly in a direct confrontation with the United States Navy. Now, as Russia steadily retires its Cold War-era fleet, it is increasingly facing the same problem that China has, a fleet of small vessels with limited displacement. For example, Russia has built new Bayan and Bayan M corvettes. However, these supposedly new ships lack anti-air and anti-submarine capabilities. They are also small and incapable of operating far from the coast. The new Karakurt-class ships are better able to operate in deeper waters, but they also lack anti-air and submarine capabilities. In 2019, the Russian Navy displaced a total of only 1.2 million tons. The United States Navy displaced 4.6 million. The gap has grown further since then as a result of Russia continuing to retire older, heavier ships and replacing them with lighter ones. The result is that Russia has an aging surface fleet, increasingly in need of repairs and unable to modernize, despite the increase in defense spending. Meanwhile, the newer ships being delivered to the Russian Navy are not adequately replacing the ones being scrapped. Russia's surface fleet is getting smaller, less capable in battle, and less able to project power over long distances. We've seen that firsthand in Ukraine, where Russia has been unable to establish naval superiority in the Black Sea west of Crimea, despite its opponent having no navy. Russia's ships are too old, vulnerable, and incapable of supporting amphibious operations. To make matters worse, the new ships seem to have little strategic purpose, which expects any confrontation between it and the United States to take place in the waters of the first island chain close to its territory. There is rationale behind building smaller vessels that can operate close to bases on the Chinese mainland. For Russia, however, this rationale does not exist. Because of its geographical isolation from the world's waterways, it needs larger ships if it is to project naval power abroad. However, Russia is steadily losing its blue water navy and is increasingly contained to the less than ideal waters near its coastline. Russia's submarine fleet appears to be better off than its surface vessels. For example, it's in a much better place than China, which still lags far behind in underwater warfare. Of Russia's 58 submarines, 37 of them are nuclear-powered, 11 of these are ballistic missile submarines, 17 of them are conventional attack submarines, and 9 are cruise missile submarines. The other 21 submarines are less modern diesel-electric attack submarines. However, just like the surface fleet, Russia's submarine fleet continues to shrink in size. The current force of 58 submarines is a downward trajectory from the 61 that Russia had in 2015, and its precipitous decline from the 366 submarines the Soviet Navy had in 1985. Although much of the reduction in fleet size had to do with the end of the Cold War, Russia has lacked the money needed to build new submarines to replace the older ones reaching the end of their service life. For example, it needed to scale back the production of its Oscar II-class nuclear-guided missile submarines and Akula-class attack submarines. The lack of funds delayed the more modern Yasen-class attack submarines too, with the first one taking 20 years to build. Only 2 of them exist. Russia's diesel-electric submarines, the Kilo class, have proven easier to build, thanks in part to international exports to countries like India. India has 12 Kilo-class submarines in its fleet, domestically called the Shishuma class. However, in 2013, one of these caught fire and exploded, raising questions about the viability of its design. Just as Russian tanks are becoming a less popular item for international buyers, Russia's naval designs are facing the same problem, further depriving the Kremlin of the money it needs to modernize its military. Russia's submarine fleet has played almost no role in the war in Ukraine. Instead of missiles from Russian submarines hitting Ukrainian targets, the opposite has proven the case. In September 23, Ukraine launched Storm Shadow cruise missile attacks on the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. A Russian submarine was one of the targets hit in this attack. Are there ways for Russia to make up for its growing naval disadvantages? To cover the shortfall in domestic industrial capacity, Russia has considered importing naval engines from China, but that's a prospect which comes with its own shortfalls. China's military technology is questionable at best, and in the face of international sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine, such orders will make Moscow even more dependent on Beijing. China could drive a hard bargain in Russia's pursuit of a modern navy. Russia is also trying to create new domestic ship designs that will help to mitigate its shortcomings. However, these seem to lack proper coordination. The Russian Navy has been designing 3 different frigate and 5 different Corvette-class ships at the same time with little coordination. The lack of a unified naval command is playing a part here, and the competing projects are draining money from the Navy's coffers instead of allowing it to concentrate on the best design. One might consider it a worse version of the United States Navy's Littoral Combat Ship program, which saw 2 different designs drain money from other, more promising ways it could have been used. Russia has had hopes for Project 23560 LIDA, a large destroyer which supposedly could, if built, adequately replace the Udaloy or Sovremeny destroyers, which are typically over 30 years old. Project 23560 LIDA is also supposedly capable of replacing the Russian Navy's 4 Slava-class cruisers, the youngest of which is the 25-year-old Pyotr Veliki. The Russian Navy designed the LIDA to be a competitor for the United States Navy's stealth Zumwalt-class destroyers, which began commissioning in 2016. The LIDA was first unveiled in March 2015, as the Zumwalt program was ramping up in America. However, the LIDA-class destroyer remains theoretical. In 2021, sources claimed that construction would begin in 2023, but this has not happened. There were rumors that the program had been scrapped, with it being dropped from the Kremlin's 2025 state armament program. Sources in Russia's shipbuilding industry then noted that the program had not been scrapped, but funding for it had been reduced. And as we've seen, because Russia lacks shipbuilding infrastructure, it could take decades for the first LIDA-class destroyer to be completed, even if construction starts. As a result of these problems, Russia is stuck with trying to modernize its existing destroyers, which, as we've seen, is a daunting prospect on its own. If Russia could update the ships adequately, such as outfitting them with modern sensors, they could theoretically stay relevant. However, given the Russian Navy's history of corruption, shortage of money, and demonstrated poor planning, that's not a prospect one should be excited to bet on. The inability of the Russian Navy to bring the LIDA-class destroyer to reality for institutional problems and lack of funding is an embarrassment for the Kremlin, but it's part of a common historical thread that spans beyond Russia. Maintaining and modernizing military forces is and always has been an expensive business in money and institutional energy. Historically, this reality has meant that most nations have needed to concentrate on either land or sea power. For example, the United Kingdom spent heavily on the Royal Navy during its imperial century, but only kept a small, although very capable and professional, land army. Russia may have long sought to be a sea power, but its geography has dictated that priority must be put into its land forces. It may have pretensions to the contrary, but post-Soviet Russia does not have the resources to build up a top-quality navy. As we've seen in Ukraine, it will need to concentrate on its army even more, as it will emerge from the war depleted of men and material. Increasingly, a navy is a luxury that Russia cannot afford. But what do you think about the state of the Russian Navy? Is there anything the Kremlin can do to turn the situation around? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. According to the Oryx blog, as of February 1st, 2024, Russia has lost 2,678 tanks during its invasion of Ukraine. Of these, 1,753 have been destroyed, making for a destruction rate of 65.4%. The total tank losses account for 21.4% of Russia's pre-war tank fleet of about 12,500 units. To make matters worse for the Kremlin, the Oryx numbers account for only the visually confirmed losses. The true number of Russian tank casualties is likely higher, in everything from the stalled convoys outside of Kyiv at the start of the war to the frequent jack-in-the-box explosions of Russian tank turrets. Putin's depleted tank force has become a meme. This meme has reinforced the opinion of some war watchers that the tank has become obsolete on the modern battlefield as a result of improved man-portable anti-tank weapons like the NLAW and Javelin, the rise of precision-guided artillery, and perhaps most importantly, the ascendancy of drones to being one of the centerpieces of warfare. However, the death of the tank is an overstated idea. Tanks remain useful in many important battlefield functions. Russia is just using its tanks improperly. In this video, we will look at how Russia has mismanaged its armored forces and the deep doctrinal origins of the tank tactics that have proven so ruinous on the battlefields of Ukraine. It is true that Russian tanks suffer from serious design flaws. The most common tank in the Russian fleet, the T-72, has some admirable qualities. Despite these flaws, it's cheap and easy to produce with a powerful 125mm smoothbore gun. However, this tank was not designed to fight in wars of the type Ukraine has evolved into. Also, the tank's ammunition is not sealed away from the crew compartment. Instead, the ammunition is stored under the crew and loaded by the T-72's autoloader. As modern man-portable anti-tank weapons target the thinly armored turret of an enemy tank, and kamikaze drones can easily dive down on such turrets as well, the results have often been a chain reaction that destroys the entire ammunition magazine, leading to the jack-in-the-box explosions that totaled the tank and its crew. The T-80 and T-90, which are ultimately based on the T-72, suffer from the same structural vulnerabilities. However, this weakness alone does not explain why Russia has lost so many tanks in Ukraine. It's also true that the Russians have simply failed to adequately support their armored units. Namely, the Russians do not have a cohesive combined arms approach to warfare. A United States Army manual from 2012 called ADRP 3.0 Unified Land Operations has a good definition of the combined arms doctrine. Combined arms is the synchronized and simultaneous application of arms to achieve an effect greater than if each arm was used separately or sequentially. Combined arms integrates leadership, information, and each of the warfighting functions and their supporting systems. Used destructively, combined arms integrates different capabilities so that counteracting one makes the enemy vulnerable to another. Used constructively, combined arms multiplies the effectiveness and efficiency of army capabilities used in stability or defense support of civil authorities. Combined arms uses the capabilities of each warfighting function and information in complementary and reinforcing capabilities. Complementary capabilities protect the weaknesses of one system or organization with the capabilities of a different warfighting function. For example, commanders use artillery fires to suppress an enemy bunker complex, pinning down an infantry unit, movement and maneuver. The infantry unit then closes with and destroys the enemy. In this example, the fire's warfighting function complements the movement and maneuver warfighting function. Although the combined arms doctrine might sound modern, it has its origins in ancient warfare. One of the more famous examples would be the Macedonian army under Philip II and his son, Alexander the Great. Like the Greeks centuries before them, these two Macedonian monarchs used the phalanx infantry formation as their army's main arm, but combined it with missile units, light infantry, and heavy cavalry. Archers and slingers would disrupt enemy formations, the phalanx would move into position to hold them in place, and heavy cavalry would deliver a smashing hammer blow from the flanks or rear, with the light infantry acting as reserve units that could be rapidly deployed as needed. In more modern times, it took a combined arms approach of well-used artillery for fire support, infantry for maneuver, and tanks for forward momentum, together under cover of air support to break the deadlock of trench warfare in World War I. Prior to this, these arms were often used separately or improperly or inadequately supported, leading to 4 bloody years of the trenches. For the United States, the lessons of combined arms warfare were reinforced during Operation Iraqi Freedom and the bitter counterinsurgency campaign that followed. Tanks proved vulnerable if they were unsupported, especially in the urban settings where the fighting concentrated. Proper infantry support was needed to maneuver toward hidden nests of enemy resistance, especially in the presence of civilians, which dictated a need for the type of accurate armored or fire support that only infantry could determine in order to prevent non-combatant casualties. Russia, on the other hand, has a doctrine that shies away from a combined arms approach to warfare, and instead heavily emphasizes artillery and tanks. The origin of this approach comes with the Soviet Union's deep battle doctrine, which was first developed in the 1920s and 30s. The deep battle idea was the Soviet Union's attempt to create a middle ground between the tactical and strategic levels of warfare, the operational art, in other words. Deep battle had one overarching objective: to keep things moving on the battlefield. At all costs, the Soviet brass wanted to avoid a repetition of the trench drudgery seen in World War I. The Soviets therefore envisioned waves of tanks smashing through narrow and vulnerable portions of the enemy front line. Wave upon wave of tanks and then infantry, supported by artillery, would pour in on the same axis and be ready to deploy in repeat operations. Stalin's purges of most of the Soviet military's best officers in the 1930s meant that the doctrine saw delays in implementation, but when it did get employed, it proved highly successful. The Nazi war machine was never able to develop a true answer for it. The Red Army bore the vast majority of the brunt of the fighting against the Nazis on land during the Second World War, and its success against Hitler solidified the notion of deep battle into Soviet and later Russian military thinking. However, there was a big flaw to deep battle. It was costly, inflicting enormous casualties on friend and foe alike. In fact, the Soviet Union suffered far more casualties than Nazi Germany did in the conflict, and although much of this was due to the Nazis striking at a time of high Russian vulnerability in 1941 and 42, not all of it was. Even in 1944, the Soviet Union suffered battlefield losses of 5 million to Nazi Germany's 1.1 million, according to Colonel Trevor N. Dupuy in his Numbers, Predictions and War. The Soviet Union could afford to take such lopsided casualties because of its overwhelming advantage in numbers and material, and because its Western allies gradually destroyed German industry through air raids, but the Red Army's wartime performance revealed a serious flaw in the deep battle doctrine. Unless you broke through quickly, you were simply sending more and more units into the deeply entrenched defensive positions, which was, in effect, asking for a repeat of the Soviet Union's miserable experience in the Winter War against Finland between 1939 and 1940. Operation Mars in 1942 showed what could happen if deep battle failed. Often called Zhukov's greatest defeat, this attack centered on the town of Rzhev against experienced German troops entrenched in well-defended positions with adequate panzer support. The Soviet Union lost about 200,000 men and perhaps two-thirds of the tanks it employed in the battle in exchange for 40,000 German casualties. The Soviets failed to dislodge the German defenders from their fortified positions. Operation Mars is little known today. Perhaps if the Kremlin remembered its lessons more, it could have avoided taking such heavy armored losses in the current war. In Ukraine, the Russians have fought with something that resembles deep battle doctrine, with similar tactics and consequences should things go wrong for the Russian armed forces. In the war's first year, Moscow preferred to use its artillery in World War II-style saturation fire. However, a shortage of ammunition has since forced the Russian army to be more selective in its target selection and fires. The use of artillery was not the only thing that resembled World War II-style employment of military force. The deep battle doctrine still haunts Russia in the way it's deployed its tanks as well. Often these armored units were and are deployed without proper infantry support. The most famous example came in the Battle of Kiev at the start of the war, where unsupported Russian tanks proved easy pickings for the elite Ukrainian infantry units armed with javelins and NLAWs. Drones have also had their way with these units. In the Battle of Kiev, stalled tank convoys were vulnerable to high-flying Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones, armed with air-to-surface missiles. Later, even cheaper first-person view FPV drones, armed with anti-tank grenades, inflicted high casualties on unsupported tank units. In Ukraine, Russian units have often moved into heavily fortified areas without support from other types of arms. Wave upon wave of Russian tanks tried dislodging entrenched Ukrainian defenders armed with tank-killing weapons to predictable results. After the failure in Kiev, Russian units managed to grind their way forward in Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts in the summer of 2022, but their tactics changed little. To make matters worse for Russia, much of the fighting in Ukraine has involved urban battlefields, which make unsupported tanks particularly vulnerable to ambushes. Russia under Putin in fact had experience on such urban battlefields during the Chechen wars of the 1990s and early 2000s, where Russian T-72 and T-80 tanks were often decimated by Chechen rebels armed with man-portable anti-tank weapons like RPGs. The Russian armored casualties were so great that Moscow was hesitant to deploy its supposedly latest and greatest tank, the T-90, into that conflict. Similarly, the Kremlin has refused to deploy the T-14 Armata onto the battlefields of Ukraine for fear of losing the few such tanks that it has, even though the Armata should theoretically do better because it's better protected from the jack-in-the-box explosions seen so often in its earlier tank types. Unlike the United States and its allies, who absorbed the lessons of urban combat in Iraq, Russia seemed to learn nothing from its miserable experience in Chechnya and made no modifications to its military doctrine before the start of the invasion of Ukraine. Again, tanks move forward without proper infantry support into urban environments. In such a setting, Russia has been left with little choice but to resort to the same tactics it used in the Chechen wars, most notably seen at Grozny. Reduce these population centers to rubble with all the defenders inside, heedless of civilian casualties. There is another problem with Russia's deep battle doctrine. Much of it is based on the massed tank versus tank battles, for which the T-72 and its successors, the T-80 and T-90, were designed. But classical tank battles have proven rare in Ukraine. Instead, tank combat is far more based on a first-look, first-kill dynamic. Drones or other assets spot tanks from far away. From there, the tank's coordinates are sent to artillery crews, or kamikaze drones are unleashed on them. The tanks are then destroyed long before they get into range to engage in combat with enemy tank formations. Soviet and Russian deep battle doctrine envisioned mass tank engagements, and military engineers designed the T-72 for this purpose. Because the T-72 was cheap, it could easily replace its losses. As we've pointed out, deep battle doctrine emphasized continuous operations that would not stop after the first breakthrough. Deep battle called for consecutive operations to fully penetrate and destroy an enemy army. Gone were the days where one could effectively destroy an enemy's army in a single engagement, such as that seen in the Battle of Guatemala under Alexander the Great. Because modern armies had hundreds of thousands or millions of men over thousands of miles of front, successive engagements would be needed to destroy their ability to present effective armed resistance. The Russian T-72 was made to deploy with such a doctrine in mind. However, warfare has gotten smaller in some ways since the days of the Second World War. In Ukraine, engagements have been fought not at the level of the corps or division that the deep battle doctrine envisioned and for which the T-72 tank and its offshoots were designed. Instead, engagements have usually come on the much smaller scale of the company or platoon level. Such small-scale engagements have meant that Russian tanks are fighting a type of war they were not designed to fight, without the numbers they need to turn the tide against well-armed Ukrainian resistance. The lack of proper air support has been another major vulnerability in the way Russia has deployed its tanks. In a theme echoing its treatment of the T-14, Russia has famously refused to deploy its supposed best fighter jet, the fifth-generation Su-57 Felon, over the skies of Ukraine. Russia has also not used its air force in a systematic way since the start of the invasion. It has not established air superiority or provided the type of close air support that the combined arms doctrine would call for, especially during the first year of the war. The modern air defense systems the Ukrainians have put in place to guard their most heavily fortified positions have made the Kremlin leery about using its air force in an offensive capacity. Russia was keener to deploy its air units, especially its helicopters, in the Zaporizhia campaign of 2023. But this was when Russia was on the defensive and its air fleet was not under as heavy a threat as it would be if it were attacking fixed Ukrainian positions in offensive operations. Aside from the doctrinal problems Russia has encountered with the use of its tanks, there are also practical reasons for Russia's inability to properly support its tanks with infantry. Russia is in a demographic decline. Unlike in the days of the Soviet Union, it no longer has an overwhelming manpower advantage compared to its enemies. Although Russia outnumbers Ukraine, the latter is in a far better position than Nazi Germany was, or even NATO was in the Cold War. Nazi Germany's population in 1938 was about 70 million people, with about 12 million men in military service by 1944. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had 195 million people, with 52.3 million men between the ages of 16 and 59. The Red Army had about 34 million men in service starting in 1941, giving the Soviet Union a manpower advantage of nearly 3 to 1 at a time when Nazi Germany's ranks were at their high point in 1944. Through much of the war, the manpower advantage was closer to 4 to 1 in the Soviets' favor. These numbers allowed for the deep battle doctrine to work during the Second World War, despite all its flaws. Today, Russia's population is about 147 million to Ukraine's population of about 33.2 million. The estimated military personnel between the two countries as of 2023 is 1.33 million to 500,000, giving Russia a manpower advantage of 2.6 to 1. In practice, the number will be less than that because Russia cannot deploy all of its armed forces to Ukraine. It needs some troops to guard its vast land borders in the Far East and elsewhere. The lack of overwhelming manpower advantage has meant that Russia's traditional style of fighting hasn't served it as well in Ukraine as it did during the Second World War. Namely, the lack of manpower advantage meant that Russia had comparatively little infantry on hand to protect its tanks, particularly during the early months of the war. The disadvantage was most pronounced in urban terrain. There, Ukrainian troops armed with advanced Western weapons like the Javelin could lay easy ambushes and destroy Russia's armored columns. The technological edge allowed for Ukraine to make up for being outnumbered, and Russia did not outnumber Ukraine by enough to compensate. Russian logistics have also proven inadequate to support the type of warfare that its traditional military doctrine calls for. Out of visually confirmed cases, 1,282 Russian tanks have been lost due to capture or abandonment. To keep tanks moving, it's necessary to keep them fueled and repaired, as they will inevitably break down under battlefield conditions. It's also necessary to have armored recovery vehicles to assist them should they malfunction or get bogged down in mud. Russia has lacked in all of these areas, which has prevented its armored columns from maintaining the momentum needed to keep an offensive going on the type of broad scale that its traditional military doctrine calls for. Meanwhile, from the start of the war, the Ukrainian military has used its tanks in a way much more similar to how they were successfully employed to break the stalemate of trench warfare in 1918. Although traditional close air support has been lacking, Ukraine has used its armor in conjunction with infantry and artillery, absorbing important lessons from the Western military training it got before and during the war. Ukraine has also, until recently, proven superior in deploying its drones to spot targets of opportunity and then exploit openings with infantry and armored forces working in concert. In short, tanks are not obsolete. Ukraine demonstrated this fact when it used its armored forces to help regain thousands of square kilometers of territory in the summer and fall of 2022. Although much less successful in 2023, Ukraine's Western tanks, such as the German Leopard, helped its armed forces to break through the first two of Russia's defensive lines in the Zaporizhia Oblast, which are the most sophisticated fortifications built in Europe since World War I. Ukraine proved unable to translate these achievements into wider breakthroughs, but it did show the continued usefulness of tanks in tasks such as storming fortified positions. The usefulness of tanks is now, as always, dependent on how they are deployed on the battlefield. Since ancient times, astute generals have understood that one type of arm is vulnerable if it's not supported by other arms. Infantry can be slow to move. Cavalry or armor is vulnerable if the momentum is halted. Artillery is practically defenseless without other units to protect it. Air support is vulnerable if there are no ground forces to protect it from anti-air fire, and so on. Russia's bitter experiences in Chechnya should have proven this point to the Kremlin's military brass. However, the ghost of the Red Army and its learning some of the wrong lessons from World War II still seems to haunt Russia's military today. If Russia has adapted in some ways since the disasters of 2022, it has done so because it learned them the hard way, through terrible losses on the battlefield. And if the recent fighting around Avdiivka is anything to go by, Russia is still very much in thrall to the ideas that have caused it to use its tanks improperly in offensive operations. But what do you think about Russia's tank doctrine and how it's deployed its armored forces in Ukraine? Is there anything it can do to improve its situation and reduce its armored casualties? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to support the channel and to get more military analysis from military experts. There has yet to be an aerial confrontation between two fifth-generation fighter jets, but tensions in Eastern Europe have now put them in the same arena, if not the same ring. Fighting out of NATO's corner is the F-35 Lightning II. Fighting out of Russia is the Su-57 Felon. If this fight became a reality, which one of these planes would win? First, let's take a look at the tail of the tape. The F-35 saw its genesis in the year 2001, when it was announced as the winner of the Joint Strike Fighter program, which began in the 1980s. The Lightning II is a multi-role fighter with several variants: the F-35A conventional takeoff and landing plane, the F-35B short takeoff and vertical landing plane, and the F-35C carrier-based plane. The F-35A entered service in 2016, the F-35B in 2015, and the F-35C in 2019. It is a single-seat plane equipped with the Pratt & Whitney F135 PW100 turbofan engine. It has a top speed of Mach 1.6, about 1,200 miles per hour, and a range of 1,700 miles per flight without refueling, a combat radius of 770 miles, and a service ceiling over 50,000 feet. The F-35 can climb at a rate of 45,000 feet per minute. Its payload includes all of the air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles in service and some of the bombs in the American arsenal. Normally, the plane can carry 4 missiles between its 2 internal weapons bays, though the coming F-35 Block 4 upgrade will increase that capacity to 6. There are also 6 pylons, 3 on each wing, for the F-35 to carry additional munitions, although this would sacrifice the plane's stealth attributes. The F-35A comes with a 25mm gun and 182 rounds as a standard attribute. The F-35B and F-35C can, if need be, mount a 25mm gun on a pod. According to Lockheed Martin, the F-35's manufacturer, the Lightning II's maneuverability has improved significantly since the first batch of planes. Its turn rate is now superior to the 4th-generation fighters in the American air fleet such as the F-15 Eagle, F-16 Fighting Falcon, and the F/A-18 Super Hornet. The F-35 can perform attacks from all angles at either slow or high speeds and enter enemy turn circles rapidly. Meanwhile, the Su-57 Felon originated in the 1980s, as the Soviet Union wished to create a modern fighter jet to compete with the premier American fighters of the time, like the F-15 Eagle. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 disrupted the project but did not put a halt to it. The current plane began as the PAK-FA, Future Frontline Aircraft System. The Kremlin planned for it to replace the MiG-29 and Su-27 while competing with the F-22 Raptor. The program began in 2001, with a prototype plane having its maiden flight in 2010. The first pre-production plane was delivered to the Russian Aerospace Forces in 2014. The Russians intended for the new aircraft to enter service in 2017 and reach full operational capacity in 2020. But it was not ready, despite the Russian brass ordering 76 of them in 2019. There are 22 of these planes in service as of December 2023. The Felon is a single-seat plane. It comes with twin Saturn AL-41F1 turbofan engines capable of delivering 35,000 pounds of thrust individually, or about 64,000 pounds together. A twin-seat version of the aircraft may be on the way. The Su-57 has a purported top speed of Mach 2, or about 1,530 miles per hour. It has a service ceiling of 66,000 feet, a climb rate of 64,000 feet per minute, and a range of 2,186 miles without refueling. The Kremlin has not revealed any details about the plane's combat radius, although some aviation experts believe it's about 750 miles. The Felon can supposedly carry a higher payload than the F-35, with up to 7,500 kilograms, with 10 internal and 6 external holders for missiles and bombs. There is also a 30mm gun for dogfighting. To further assist it in close-quarters combat, the Felon's engines have a 3D thrust vectoring feature. This feature allows an Su-57's pilot to control the outflow of the plane's engines regardless of the aircraft's direction. In other words, the Su-57 might be flying in one direction, but the engine could be pointing in a different direction. This feature could be particularly useful in a dogfight, as it would allow the Felon to outmaneuver its opponent. The F-35 does not have 3D thrust vectoring. At first glance, the tail of the tape would seem to favor the Su-57 in a traditional match. The Felon has a higher maximum speed, climb rate, and altitude, can carry more weapons, has a longer range, and has 3D thrust vectoring engines to give it an edge in a visual range dogfight. If both planes wound up detecting each other, the advantage should swing to the Russian plane. This reality would be in line with the design of the two fighters. The F-35 is a multi-role plane, while the Su-57 is far more dedicated to air superiority, although it can adapt to other roles like attacking ground targets. However, dogfights are rare in modern warfare. While it would be premature to call them extinct, American military planners believed such a thing in the early 1960s, and those beliefs turned disastrous in the skies over Vietnam. The advent of stealth technology, longer-range missiles, and more sensitive radar means that visual-range plane battles will continue to become less frequent. Greater situational awareness, early detection, and ability to kill from long range are and will increasingly be the most important parts of establishing air superiority. In other words, spot the enemy and shoot him down from long range before he can spot you and do the same. The F-35 has its strengths in precisely these areas. The Lightning II is a true stealth aircraft. Aside from being coated in radar-absorbent materials, everything about the plane's design is made for stealth, including its size. It's a relatively small plane, at 51.4 feet in length, 14.4 feet in height, a wingspan of 35 feet, and a wing area of 460 square feet. The face of the F-35's engine is concealed in a way to add further stealth. In all, the F-35 has a radar cross-section with the profile of a golf ball. The F-35 is even stealthier than the F-22, according to the USAF brass, and its radar-absorbent coating is more durable than the Raptor's. Although the exact details are naturally classified, the F-22 can be detected at a range under 10 miles. The F-35 would therefore be even less detectable. Although it is also coated with radar-absorbent materials, the Su-57's design is much less stealthy than its American opponent, to the point that some aviation experts do not regard it as a true stealth plane or fifth-generation fighter aircraft. It is bigger than the Lightning II at 66 feet long and 15 feet high. Its wingspan is 46 feet with a wing area of 848 square feet. To be sure, the Su-57 has a much lower radar cross-section than the Russian fighter jets that preceded it. However, this stealth profile is mostly concentrated in the front of the plane. In contrast to the F-22 and the even stealthier F-35, the Su-57 can be detected at a range of 35 miles. However, the Su-57 might be even less stealthy than this, and we'll discuss those allegations at the end of the video. If the stealth features of the Su-57 are as advertised, the Felon might be able to compete with the Lightning II if the two planes are approaching each other directly. However, if it were to turn or maneuver, the Felon is much more detectable than the F-35. The Felon would therefore have to try and detect the incoming American plane and shoot it down without exposing its sides or rear. The two planes' missile armaments might be the deciding factor. For air-to-air combat, the F-35 can carry the AIM-9X Sidewinder for short-range engagements up to about 22 miles. The British AIM-132 ASRAAM is also compatible with the F-35 and can hit shorter-range targets about 15 miles away. For longer range, the Lightning II can carry the AIM-120 AMRAAM to hit targets about 65 miles away. In the future, the Block 4 F-35B variants will have the capability to be armed with the European MBDA Meteor, which can hit targets about 125 miles away, though this capacity is not expected until 2027. The F-35 will also soon be armed with the hypersonic AIM-260 JATM, which can hit targets about 120 miles away. The new missile will be integrated into the F-35's potential armaments as it starts to enter service. The Su-57 can also be armed with a panoply of air-to-air missiles at different ranges. First, there is the R-73 for shorter distances up to 25 miles. For medium to longer range combat, the Su-57 can carry the R-77M, which can hit targets up to a range of 120 miles. Then there is the hypersonic R-37, which can hit targets at about the same distance with speeds of Mach 6. In a direct confrontation, the Su-57 would have more shots and have a greater reach than the current F-35, although that advantage would be lost once the Lightning II gets the AIM-260 and the MBDA Meteor. So far, things don't seem to be that promising for the F-35. However, to make use of its greater ammunition and range, the Su-57 must first detect its target F-35 before it gets detected itself. As we have seen in the two planes' particular stealth configurations, this might prove difficult for the Russian fighter to do. From what we do know, the F-35 would usually have the advantage of early detection. The F-35 is the world's most sophisticated sensory aircraft. A few aviation experts have likened it to a supercomputer in the sky. The F-35 comes equipped with the AN/APG-81 Active Electronically Scanned Array (AESA) radar system. The range of the AN/APG-81 is, as you would expect, a highly guarded secret, but some aviation experts think it can spot targets between 250 and 300 miles away. The AN/APG-81 can provide high-resolution ground mapping to the F-35's pilot. The Lightning II also comes equipped with a network of cameras at various points on the plane to give the pilot a 360-degree field of view, with the information being fed directly into the helmet. These capabilities will be increased even further with the coming F-35 Block 4 upgrades. The F-35's sensors also include the Advanced Electro-Optical Targeting System and a custom-made AN/ASQ-239 Barracuda electronic warfare system, developed by BAE Systems. The Barracuda provides both offensive and defensive electronic warfare support, which provides all-aspect broadband protection to suppress enemy radar systems and assist the F-35 in targeting valuable assets. For example, the Barracuda Electronic Warfare Suite can turn the F-35 into a stand-in electronic warfare attack platform, without needing to call upon a specialized plane. In this capacity, an F-35 approaching an enemy air defense system could attempt to jam it with its onboard electronic warfare suite. The Barracuda system is also an open architecture one, designed to allow for the addition of new capabilities as they become available. Current F-35s can track 23 enemy planes in 9 seconds and engage 19 in under 3 seconds. The Su-57 also comes equipped with its own AESA radar system, the NO-36 Bielka. This radar provides X and L band modes to make it more resistant to enemy electronic warfare countermeasures. The radar provides a 120-degree field of view in elevation and azimuth, the angle between a reference plane and a point. This is the highest possible number for a flat phase array antenna. Though the radar's range is also naturally a secret, some estimates suggest that the NO-36 Bielka can detect an 11-square-foot target at a range of roughly 250 miles. The radar system is spread across the felon's body. The Su-57 also comes packed with equipment to give it improved situational awareness. This equipment includes cameras interspersed throughout the plane to give the pilot the information. At first glance, the two planes seem roughly comparable in their radars and electronic warfare abilities. But the F-35 should have longer range detection now and a reduced cross-section. In the short future, the F-35's advantage in this area will grow, as the Block 4 version of the Lightning II will come with a new radar, the AN/APG-85, produced by Northrop Grumman. While the details are of course another secret, the new radar will have an even longer range than its predecessor. It will also have higher resolution, superior tracking, and better electronic warfare capabilities such as jamming and degrading enemy radars. The new radar will have these superior features in part thanks to it being based on a gallium nitride semiconductor system. This same technology is also being designed for the United States Air Force's coming 6th-generation fighter jet, the Next Generation Air Dominance (NGAD) program, giving the F-35 some features of a 6th-generation plane. The current F-35 versus the advertised features of the Su-57 should make for a close contest. Both have similar range, although the F-35's radar has a slightly longer range. Their missiles have similar range too, although the Russian R-37 is faster. The coming Block 4 F-35, combined with the AIM-260 JATM, should give the Lightning II a decided advantage over the Felon at longer distances. The design specifications between the two planes suggest that the F-35 should be able to detect the Felon from further away and shoot it before it can in turn be detected. The F-35 also carries another advantage, sensor fusion, which would prove a significant advantage in any real-world meeting between the two jets. The Su-57 has sensor fusion capabilities of its own. It can link up with Russian assets in the air and on the ground and share its data. However, the F-35's sensor fusion capability is unparalleled. The Lightning II's sensor fusion capabilities can generate real-time pictures of the battlefield and feed it to friendly forces, enabling a combined arms approach to tactical situations through information integration. The Block 4 F-35 will have even greater sensor fusion capabilities. The coming capability will create something that the American military brass calls kill webs, integrating an all-domain approach to target selection and striking. For example, in a scenario involving a meeting between the F-35 and Su-57, the former would be able to more easily relay targeting information to a friendly aircraft or a nearby air defense system that might be in a better position to shoot the incoming Russian plane down. In addition to adding to the F-35's network capabilities, the kill web ability will help the Lightning II to maintain its stealth profile, since it would not need to open its weapons bay to shoot down the incoming Russian aircraft. For a plane that already had a stealth advantage, the kill web would greatly add to its ability to detect and shoot down the Su-57 before it detects the F-35. As we've seen in a direct fight between the two planes, a first look first kill ability for the F-35 is its key to victory. The Lightning II is not a plane that was engineered to take part in close quarters combat like the Su-57. Its purpose is not air superiority, but to be a jack-of-all-trades force multiplier. If the Su-57 can detect its American enemy, it should have the advantage. However, since the Su-57 is more visible to radar than the F-35, in long-range combat scenarios, the Lightning II should be better able to shoot down its Russian rival, particularly once the AIM-260 JATM becomes available in large numbers. That process is expected to begin in 2024 and will be completed by the end of the decade. The advent of kill webs will add to the F-35's advantages at long range. Perhaps that is no longer a one-on-one fight, but in any real wartime scenario, both of these planes will serve as one component in a much bigger framework. A real confrontation between these two fighters would not involve a one-on-one fight, but as part of a network, and this would be where the Su-57 would find itself at its most pronounced disadvantage. The Russian aerospace forces have been hesitant to deploy their newest toy in the skies of Ukraine. For all its capabilities, the Kremlin does not appear to be too confident about the new plane's ability to hide from enemy planes and air defense systems. Most war watchers have observed that the Russian brass is afraid to lose the Su-57 Felon. As we mentioned, only 22 of them are in service as of the end of 2023. Production delays and international sanctions may prevent the Russian military from acquiring the initial batch of 76 that it ordered in 2019. Meanwhile, over 1,000 F-35 Lightning II planes have been built as of January 2024. The United States alone plans to buy a total of 2,457 F-35 aircraft. In any scenario involving hostilities in Eastern Europe, the Su-57 would be significantly outnumbered. The Felon's flaws might go deeper than its production problems. Chris Bolton, an aviation expert, noted on his Twitter feed in June 2022 that the Russian plane has a much larger radar cross-section than commonly reported. According to him, the Su-57 has a radar cross-section similar to the fourth-generation FA-18 Super Hornet, making it 1,000 times less stealthy than the F-35. Experts have commonly mentioned that the Su-57 is by far the least stealthy of the 4 fifth-generation aircraft currently in the world's skies, a roster that also includes the F-22 Raptor and China's Chengdu J-20. Such a lack of stealth profile might explain why the Kremlin has been so hesitant to deploy it over Ukraine's battlefields and has so far only used it in a long-range support role from Russian airspace. If this is true, the Su-57 would be at a much more pronounced disadvantage against the F-35 than commonly believed. And it's for this reason why many aviation experts do not consider the Felon a true fifth-generation fighter, but rather an advanced fourth-generation plane. Despite numerous doubts, the Su-57 boasts some impressive features. In a traditional plane-versus-plane fight at visual range, it would likely beat the F-35. The F-35 would also need to be careful about its shot placement, because in a fight with the Su-57 Felon, it would not be able to carry external weapons and expect to survive, because doing so would give up its stealth advantage. However, the F-35 is far more capable to meet the demands of the modern battlefield, and it will only get more capable over the coming years. It is arguable that the Kremlin built a plane to fight the last war. So although it is a capable aircraft, it might not be capable enough to stand up to its true fifth-generation rivals like the F-35. The Kremlin has stated that the current Su-57 will not be the final version, with the Russian brass even claiming that upgrades could make the Felon the first sixth-generation fighter flying the world's skies, ahead of even the NGAD. Safe to say, most aviation experts are very skeptical about these claims. In most practical, real-world fights between the two planes, it would likely be smarter to put your money on the F-35 under most conditions. But do you agree? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. How incompetent can Putin get? Since the war in Ukraine started, he's been losing tanks by the dozens on a daily level. His military has been unable to deliver powerful air and artillery strikes or apply modern military tactics and strategies, and the list doesn't stop there. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the world's attention was naturally riveted on the land war. There, Russia's poor command structure and logistical incompetence became apparent within the first week, with the attack on Kyiv stalling. Since then, Russia has been forced to take hundreds of thousands of casualties in a war of attrition that has raged for 20 months and counting. However, Russia's incompetence has extended to the seas as well. In the build-up to the conflict and early stages of the war, military observers feared that Russia would quickly take control of the seas and stage an amphibious attack on Odessa, Ukraine's third largest city. If Russia took Odessa, it would essentially cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea entirely and leave it a poor, landlocked rump state. Such fears proved unfounded. A landing near Odessa never came. Instead, the biggest stories involving Russia's navy in this war have been of its numerous humiliations. What happened? Today, Russia has essentially ceded control of the western Black Sea and is increasingly not even safe within its haven in Crimea. But why has the Russian navy proven so ineffective in the war? To be as fair as we can to Russia, it is and always has been in a bad geostrategic position with regards to the sea. Ever since the days of Peter the Great, Russia has aspired to be a sea power. However, geography makes this difficult to do, as its ports are either contained within choke points, freeze over in the winter, or both. The quest for improved access to the sea has been a vital objective for Russia's foreign policy since the early 18th century, and Russia has never quite been able to achieve this goal. Even at the height of its power during the Soviet Union, unrestricted access to the sea was an objective that still eluded Moscow. In this light, it is understandable why Russia places such a high strategic importance on Crimea and why it was willing to use military force to secure it. It is one of Russia's few warm water ports. Unfortunately for the Russians, there's a problem. The Turks command the transit points between the Black and Mediterranean seas through their control of the Bosporus and Dardanelles. This control was formalized through the 1936 Montreux Convention regarding the regime of the Straits. The convention allows complete freedom of transit for the commercial vessels of any country through these straits during peacetime. In times of war, however, Turkey, if it is not a party to the conflict, can close the straits to transiting ships unless they are returning to their bases. 3 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, Turkey invoked the Montreux Convention's wartime provisions for the first time, refusing Russian naval vessels in the Mediterranean access to the Black Sea. For example, at the end of November 2022, 2 Russian warships left the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal after 9 months of idling after Turkey forbid them from transiting through the Dardanelles and Bosporus to the Black Sea. The effect of the Montreux Convention has been to cut off Russia's ability to reinforce its Black Sea fleet. For Ukraine, this was a significant piece of diplomatic aid. It immediately made Russian naval officers more cautious, knowing that every ship in the fleet was precious. Even so, it seemed far-fetched that Ukraine would be able to significantly impede the operations of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. That opinion quickly started to change, however. Ukraine proved its ability to strike at the Russian Navy early in the war. 3 days after it invaded Ukraine, and on the same day the Turks invoked the Montreux Convention, Russia captured the strategically important port of Berdyansk. The Ukrainian military and Western observers were understandably concerned that the Russian ships that piled into Berdyansk could either land troops in the rear of Ukraine's southern lines or attack Odessa. Then, at about 7:45 a.m. on March 24th, exactly a month after the invasion, the landing craft Saratov mysteriously exploded and sank in port at Berdyansk. Ships of the Saratov's class, the Alligator-class tank landing ship, can land up to 425 soldiers or marines, with armored support of either 40 infantry fighting vehicles or 20 tanks. The loss of this vessel was thus a significant blow to Russia's ability to conduct amphibious operations. How did this happen? From the beginning of the conflict, NATO has provided Ukraine with excellent intelligence and Ukraine's intelligence units got the word that the Saratov was loaded with munitions at the time of the attack. Ukraine used this intelligence and a Cold War-era Tochka-U Scarab short-range ballistic missile to carry out the deed. The Tochka-U has a range of about 120 kilometers. We do not know how many of these missiles Ukraine used in the attack, but what is known is that Russia's modern air defense systems should have easily been able to intercept these Soviet weapons. Russian media at the time reported that its forces had done just that, although the real story came in July, when the Saratov was raised from the depths of the sea. Russia's supposedly modern air defense network failed to act against a much older weapon system. Meanwhile, two other ships, the Seyza-Kunikov and Novocherkassk, were seen on video departing from the flaming Saratov. They also suffered damage in the attack and were forced to retreat to Crimea. 11 sailors on board the Saratov died in the incident. Ukraine's next assault on the Russian Navy would become the most famous of the war. This was the sinking of the cruiser Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, in April 2022. This incident was apparently so humiliating for Russia that its Ministry of Defense still offers no details about what happened and avoids talking about it in public, to the point that the families of the sailors on board are still left in the dark about the fates of their loved ones. How exactly this incident unfolded is still unclear. After the successful attack, American sources reported that the Ukrainians had used liquid-fueled Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles, sending them to coordinates provided by US intelligence by way of a P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance aircraft that flew out of Italy and looked around the Black Sea. Ukraine denied this report, however. According to the Ukrainians, April 13, 2022 was the worst day to sink the cruiser because the weather was so bad for such a precise, premeditated attack. The coastline was covered with low, dark rain clouds on that day. The Ukrainian radars in the area had a limited 18-kilometer range because of the bad weather. Knowing this, the Moskva's crew got a wee bit careless. According to Ukrainian sources, at the time of the invasion, we had no over-the-horizon radars, and Russia knew it. But since the clouds were very low and a signal in this corridor between the water and the clouds had nowhere to go, the radar suddenly reached and identified Moskva. The ship's crew seemingly ignored this potentially deadly situation and were so lax about their security that the air defense systems were inactive. They had not noticed that they had just sailed to within the Neptune's 200-kilometer range. Ukraine may have at this point used a Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drone to distract the Moskva and then launch the missiles. For a while after the attack, Ukrainian crews did not know what happened, but radar soon revealed that 4 Russian ships were rushing to the Moskva from different directions. Later, the Ukrainians realized that a tugboat had also been dispatched from Crimea, hoping to save the ailing ship. At this point, the weather cooperated again too. When a storm began at sea and made rescue operations much harder, it became impossible to save the Moskva then, and it sank beneath the waves. Hundreds of Russian sailors reportedly saw their flagship get hit by 2 Neptune missiles. The Moskva incident is more baffling because the ship was an air defense cruiser. If running properly, the Moskva should have gotten as much as 4 minutes of warning that the Ukrainian cruise missiles were on their way. The Russian cruiser also had a triple layer of protection against such air attacks. Its defenses included the S-300F surface-to-air missiles, 9K-33 OSA air defense missiles, AK-360 close-in 30mm cannons, chaff, decoys, and electronic defense systems. However, no one recorded the Moskva using any of these systems against the Ukrainian cruise missiles. The ship just sat there. Why were none of these systems active? Was the ship's radar system defective? We might never know the answer. Whatever the reason, the Moskva was the largest Russian vessel sunk since World War II, and the first loss of a Russian flagship since the Russo-Japanese War. Russia says that 18 crew members died. Other sources say it was as many as 600. Either way, the incident shocked the Kremlin. With Ukraine's demonstrated anti-ship capabilities and no way for it to bring replacements thanks to the Turks' invocation of the Montreux Convention, Russia became even more cautious about how it would use its naval assets. Since this incident, the Black Sea Fleet has been bottled up around its base in Sevastopol, Crimea. With this knowledge, Ukrainian troops confidently strode forward with their Kherson counteroffensive between August and November of 2022, safe in the knowledge that the Russian Navy would not be bothering them with missile attacks from the Black Sea, let alone amphibious operations behind their lines. Even with the Russian Navy's retreat to the relatively safe Crimea, Ukraine wasn't done showing off its prowess in sinking ships. Next up was the rescue tug Vasily Bek. While far less spectacular a target than the Moskva, these tugs are important to the maintenance of a naval fleet. This role is especially important in the Black Sea due to Russia's inability to reinforce its fleet. This ship was new too, being launched in 2016 and commissioned in 2017. On June 17, 2022, Ukrainian forces attacked the Vasily Bek when it was on its way to resupply Russian soldiers stationed on Snake Island, a place already made famous from the start of the war, when the garrison there used colorful language in response to Russia's demands for surrender. The Ukrainians hit the Vasily Bek with 2 Harpoon anti-ship cruise missiles. The ship stood no chance and went down, with about 10 Russian KIA in the incident and a $25 million Tor air defense system on board that was supposed to be placed on the island. On June 30th, Russia evacuated its garrison from Snake Island. Moscow claimed that this move was an act of goodwill in recognition of a humanitarian corridor that was part of its grain export deal with Ukraine. In reality, Russia evacuated its troops from Snake Island because the attack on the Vasily Bek made its military brass realize that it's too risky to reinforce and resupply the outpost. It was a tacit admission that Russia had ceded the Black Sea west of Crimea to Ukraine. But the Ukrainians weren't done yet. The Olenigorsky Gornyak, a Rapucha-class landing ship, was Ukraine's next target. On August 4, 2023, Ukraine used drone boats to swarm the ship and its neighbors when it was docked in the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. Not all the drones made it through Russian defenses, but the attack on the Olenigorsky Gornyak succeeded. The ship did not sink, but it needed to be put in a dry dock to repair the heavy damage. It's unlikely that the ship will return to action anytime soon. The water drone Ukraine used in the attack was a new low-visibility grey boat that can be operated via remote control. The drone boat has a high payload, able to carry a 300-kilogram warhead up to a range of 800 kilometers. The boat also features a satellite communications array at its rear. A Ukrainian operator of these drones explained their low profile was designed to exploit weaknesses in Russian ship defenses. It was an adaptation from their earlier attacks, where Russian ships spotted drone boats and sank them with artillery and small arms fire once they got to within visual range. The attack on the Olenigorsky Gornyak reveals that Ukraine has absorbed these lessons and is adapting with its newer drone boats. Russia claims that it foiled a similar attack on an oil facility after this incident, but as always, these claims should be treated with skepticism. Most recently, Ukraine attacked targets in Sevastopol, the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and other targets in Crimea. On September 13th, Ukrainian forces struck the Sergo-Ordzhonikidze shipyard in Sevastopol, a major repair base. Ukraine reportedly used 10 Franco-British Storm Shadow cruise missiles in the attack. Russia's Ministry of Defense claims that air defense systems in the area shot 7 of these missiles down, but that effort was clearly not enough. The Russian Kilo-class diesel-electric submarine Rostov-on-Don and the large landing ship Minsk were struck and destroyed by the Storm Shadows. Key infrastructure on the base was also damaged in this incident. However, the missile attack was only the climax of the operation. Other units were essential for shaping it. Prior to the attack, Ukrainian special operators seem to have destroyed one of Russia's nearby S-400 air defense systems and took control of an oil facility that housed a local radar unit. By downing these systems, the Ukrainians set the stage for the strike on Sevastopol. It would only be the first of several attacks on Crimean targets in the weeks ahead. On September 14th, Ukraine again struck at the Russian Navy on the seas. Its general staff said it had targeted 2 ships in the western Black Sea and released a video showing a Russian patrol ship appearing to come under attack by drone boats. The Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed that one of its ships, the Sergei Kotov, had been attacked, but repelled the assault. Meanwhile, that same day, Ukrainian forces used cruise missiles and drones to destroy a Russian air defense network in the Crimean city of Yevpatoria. Then, on September 22nd, Ukraine launched another attack on Sevastopol. Ukraine sent several Storm Shadow cruise missiles at targets there. Russia claims that it shot most of them down, but one made it through, hitting the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters. The attack set the main building ablaze, and Russian officials said at least 1 service member went missing in the aftermath. Ukraine alleges that the strike was timed to coincide with a meeting of high-level Russian officials. Kirilo Budanov, Ukraine's intelligence chief, says that 2 Russian commanders were badly injured in the attack. Later, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces said the strike had killed Viktor Sokolov, the commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, along with 33 others. No independent source verified this claim, however. Sokolov reportedly attended a soccer awards ceremony to prove he was not dead on September 27th, although there are claims that this was a duplicate. As always, we should know more in time. What we do know is that the Institute for the Study of War confirmed an attack on the 744th Communications Center of the Command of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. And the problems are only piling on for Russia. In late September, the Biden administration seemingly finally gave Ukraine what it has wanted for so long. Although it was not officially announced, it's likely that Ukraine will be getting ATACMS missiles in the near future. These weapons can hit targets up to 300 kilometers away, 50 kilometers further than the Storm Shadow. And unlike the Storm Shadow, which requires a riskier launch from a fighter jet, ATACMS can be fired from Ukraine's HIMARS platforms on the ground. ATACMS would be ideal for launching attacks on Sevastopol. Meanwhile, if Ukraine gets ATACMS, it's also possible that Germany will agree to supply Ukrainians with Taurus air-launched cruise missiles that have even greater range than ATACMS. This weapon system would be ideal for targeting the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland. A drone attack already damaged the Kerch Bridge a year ago. This scenario would be far more threatening. Ukraine has renewed its attacks on Crimea for a few reasons. First, Russia has allowed the grain export deal that Turkey and the UN brokered in July 2022 to expire. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has resumed its blockade of such exports, making it a more important target for Ukraine to destroy. Crimea is also the linchpin of Russia's logistics in Ukraine. Being able to resupply its troops from Crimea is vital to the Russian war effort. Ukrainian disruption of Russian Navy logistics from Crimea is one of the reasons why Moscow now considers it too dangerous to send ships to the west of the peninsula. An attack on Russia's ports in Crimea would disrupt the supply chain to all the branches of Russia's military, and it appears that the Black Sea Fleet is helpless in stopping such attacks. Crimea is also a highly political target, with Ukrainian President Zelensky saying that this war started in Crimea and will end in Crimea. The recapture of Crimea would be the greatest victory for the Ukrainian military, a highly symbolic measure of its triumph. The stakes are just as high, or even higher, for Putin. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, he sold his occupation and annexation of Crimea to the Russian public as his crowning foreign policy achievement. If Russian occupation of Crimea becomes untenable through missile and drone attacks, and supplying the Russian forces in other parts of Ukraine from Crimea also becomes untenable, Putin's political position at home erodes, and the entire Russian war effort risks breaking down. The war has already put Russia through isolation, economic hardship, and hundreds of thousands of casualties. If Russia cannot gain anything from the hostilities and winds up losing Crimea too, or if it at least cannot use the peninsula for strategic purposes, it's difficult to see how Putin would be able to remain in power, which he plans to do until at least 2036. In this scenario, Russian elites may decide that the time is right for their country to finally get a new leader. There is a presidential election in Russia in 2024. Although elections in Russia are only formalities, the 2024 election could serve as a pretext to oust Putin from power if the war goes too poorly between now and then. It's understandable why Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet would become an increasingly high priority for Ukraine. All wars are first and foremost political. Even if things don't turn out that way, Ukraine's effective neutralization of the Russian Black Sea Fleet is an astounding military achievement. Early in the war, Ukraine forced the Black Sea Fleet to retreat to what it believed was the safety of Crimea. Now, through the actions of its intelligence units, special operators, and missile and air units, it's showing that not even Crimea is safe. If ATACMS and Taurus missiles soon arrive, that point will only be made clearer. What do you think will come next in the war at sea? Will Ukraine soon use ATACMS missiles to destroy Russian ships and docks in Sevastopol? Is the Kerch Bridge safe for Russia? Let us know what you think in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.